Hey guys, tonight we are easing into a very specific corner of the past, slipping through the veil of centuries to find ourselves standing, hypothetically speaking, in the chilly, echoing stone halls of a monastery in 14th century France. Imagine the thick, gray light filtering through narrow, arched windows, casting long, slow shadows that stretch and contract with the sun's crawl across the sky. You can almost feel the damp seeping up from the flagstone floor through your worn leather sandals. And the air carries a faint, persistent scent of old parchment, beeswax candles, and perhaps just a hint of stale incense. This isn't the bustling marketplace or the muddy village street. This is a place built for stillness, for contemplation, for a life lived at a different speed, dictated by the rhythmic peal of bells and the quiet turning of pages. It's a place where you might frankly die of sheer historical accuracy withdrawal if you stayed too long without Wi-Fi. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are here, not really of course, but let's settle into the feeling of it. You are a silent observer, a wisp of consciousness drifting through these ancient stones. The building itself feels alive, but in a slow, geological kind of way. The stones harvested from the earth centuries ago hold the cold within them, a constant low temperature that seems to permeate everything. Your breath makes a tiny plume in the air, visible even indoors. Sound doesn't just travel here, it bounces, lingers, and dies slowly. A dropped book echoing down a corridor feels like an explosion. The scrape of a wooden bench on stone floor sounds like grinding teeth. Most of the time, though, there is just silence. A deep, heavy, almost palpable silence, broken only by the intentional sounds of monastic life. Think about the quiet. It's not the quiet of a deserted house or a closed shop at night. It's a structured quiet, a deliberate absence of noise. These men, the monks who inhabit this space, have chosen this life, a life stripped back to essentials, a life where worldly clamor is actively rejected. They move with a quiet purpose, their heavy wool robes rustling faintly, their footsteps muffled by thick soles on the stone. Their voices, when they speak at all outside of prayer or necessary tasks, are kept low, often just above a whisper. It's a world of hushed tones and lowered gazes, a constant exercise in self-control and submission. Imagine trying to live like that today. Your phone would probably spontaneously combust from lack of stimulation within the first hour. Mine certainly would. The architecture itself enforces this. High walls, enclosed courtyards, thick doors. They don't just keep the outside world out, they trap the stillness within. The cloister, that covered walkway surrounding a central garden, is the heart of this physical quiet. It's where monks might walk in contemplation, pray individually, or read. The arcade arches frame the garden, a small patch of controlled nature, often with a well or fountain at its center. The sound of dripping water might be one of the few constant natural noises here, a gentle counterpoint to the stone silence. You walk along the path, your steps echoing softly under the vaulted ceiling. The air is cool and still. Even the scents change subtly. The damp earth of the garden, the slightly dusty smell of the stone, the faintest whiff of oil from the lamps used after dusk. Life here revolves around a relentless schedule, dictated by the divine office. The cycle of daily prayers performed at specific hours throughout the day and night. Matins in the deepest dark before dawn, lauds as the first light appears, prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none mid-afternoon, vespers in the evening, and compline before sleep. 7 times a day, plus matins and lauds often combined. You'd need a calendar just to remember which prayers were happening when, though for the monks, it was etched into their very being. This constant rhythm underlies everything, a bedrock of sound and silence. Bells ring to summon them from whatever task they are performing, working in the fields, copying manuscripts, cooking, cleaning, and they drop everything to gather in the chapel, the Abbey Church, for prayer. The rest of the time, silence is the rule, especially in areas like the refectory, dining hall, where eating is often accompanied by a monk reading scripture aloud, or the cloister itself. Speaking of the refectory, mealtimes were another exercise in disciplined quiet. Food was simple, often vegetarian, centered around bread, beans, lentils, and vegetables from the monastery garden. Fish was permitted, but meat was often restricted or forbidden, a form of ascetic discipline. Imagine eating every meal in near total silence, listening only to someone reading aloud. It's a far cry from your average family dinner or quick office lunch break, isn't it? No idle chatter, no complaining about the food, not out loud anyway. Just quiet consumption and spiritual instruction. You might get a small ration of ale or wine, but excess was frowned upon. It's hard to picture throwing a surprise party here, let's just say that. This austere lifestyle, the detachment from worldly comforts, the relentless schedule, the physical labor, because not all monks were scribes or scholars. Many worked the land or performed manual tasks. It was all designed to focus the mind and spirit on God. And in this focused, quiet environment, a different kind of activity flourished: the preservation and creation of knowledge. While much of Europe outside monastic walls was focused on survival, warfare, or trade, monasteries became accidental storehouses of learning. They copied texts, not just religious ones, but also works of classical literature, history, philosophy, and science, saving them from potential destruction and ensuring their survival through the turbulent early Middle Ages. It's a mainstream historical fact that without the painstaking work of monastic scribes, much of ancient knowledge would have been lost to us entirely. They were, in effect, the hard drives of the medieval world, archiving information one laborious page at a time. The living conditions were basic by modern standards. Monks typically slept in a common dormitory, often in individual cells or partitioned cubicles, but sometimes just on straw mattresses laid out on the floor. They usually slept in their clothes, ready to get up for matins in the deep night. Bathing was infrequent, seen more as a necessity for cleanliness than a comfort or luxury. Personal possessions were minimal, often limited to a few books, writing implements, and perhaps a small cross or devotional object. Everything was communal: the work, the prayer, the food, the sleeping quarters, reinforcing the idea of a shared life dedicated to a higher purpose. Historians still argue whether the strictness of these rules was universally applied, or if there was more variation and perhaps quiet bending of the rules than the official texts suggest. It's hard to know exactly what went on behind these thick stone walls all the time, isn't it? Were there whispered jokes after lights out, secret snacks hoarded? Probably not, but you never know. You might think of this existence as incredibly boring, and from a certain perspective, it probably was. Repetitive tasks, limited social interaction, a life lived largely within the same stone confines. But within this structured, silent world, there was also a deep intensity, a focus that is hard for us to grasp in our hyper-connected age. Every action, every thought was meant to have spiritual significance. Even the act of copying a text was considered a form of prayer, a way of engaging with the divine word. The scriptorium, the room where scribes worked, was often one of the coldest places in the monastery, requiring immense discipline to sit for hours, often in poor light, hunched over a desk, meticulously forming letter after letter. Imagine doing that all day, every day, without autocorrect or spell check. Gives you a new appreciation for your laptop, doesn't it? This wasn't just about personal salvation. It was also about contributing to the spiritual and intellectual life of the community, and through that, the wider world. The books they copied weren't just for their own use. They were for other monasteries, for bishops, sometimes even for wealthy lay patrons. They were conduits of information, preserving the past and disseminating learning, however slowly, across the medieval landscape. This slow, deliberate pace was the norm. Travel was difficult and dangerous, communication was slow, and news spread person to person, village to village. A monastery, with its library and its network of connections to other religious houses, was like a quiet node in this slow-moving network of information. And within its stone heart, the library was the most precious treasure of all. You can sense its presence somewhere in the building, a repository of knowledge and thought. The intellectual core of this quiet, disciplined life. It is towards this silent sanctuary that the next beats of our story will inevitably lead us. So you are here, a phantom presence in this quiet stone world, drawn toward the heart of its intellectual life. That heart, in a place dedicated to prayer and manual labor, resides within its library. Finding the library in a medieval monastery isn't like looking for the big library sign in a modern town square. It wasn't always a single grand room, though some larger abbeys did have impressive spaces. Often, especially in the earlier periods or smaller houses, the books might be kept in presses or chests within the cloister walk itself, or in a room directly adjacent to the scriptorium, the writing room. Imagine, if you will, finding this room. Perhaps it's upstairs, away from the damp of the ground floor. Perhaps it's tucked into a quiet corner where the light is best for reading during the day. You step inside and the air changes. It feels drier, perhaps cooler still than the rest of the monastery, a temperature carefully maintained year-round to protect the precious contents. The primary scent here is one of old parchment, a dry, slightly musty smell, mixed with the faint, sweet scent of beeswax that might have been used to polish furniture or was simply present from the candles burned when daylight failed. Dust motes dance in the limited shafts of light that pierce through the narrow windows, perhaps glazed with thick, uneven glass that distorts the view of the outside world. These windows are likely high up to prevent theft and perhaps also to limit direct sunlight, which could damage the delicate inks and parchment. The room itself is simple but purposeful. Stone walls, perhaps whitewashed, absorb sound, contributing to the pervasive quiet. Along the walls you see presses, essentially large, sturdy cupboards or chests, where books might be stored horizontally, or perhaps rows of wooden shelves built directly into the walls. The books aren't standing upright like yours probably are on your bookshelves. They are often laid flat or stacked. This method helped preserve the often fragile bindings and prevented the heavy volumes from sagging. Some larger books, especially those used for reading aloud in the refectory or chapel, might rest on inclined reading stands. There might be a few sturdy wooden desks or tables where monks could sit to consult the books, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of elbows and parchment edges. Look closer at the books themselves. They aren't the uniformly printed paperbacks you're used to. Each one is a unique artifact, painstakingly created by hand. They vary in size dramatically, from small, personal prayer books that could fit in a pocket, though pockets weren't quite like ours, to massive, heavy Bibles or liturgical texts that required two hands to lift and would sit on a special stand. The bindings are often wood-covered in leather, sometimes decorated with blind stamping, patterns pressed into the leather. Some important or wealthy monasteries might even have bindings adorned with precious metals or jewels, though that would be exceptional and more common for display copies in the church rather than the working library. The texts within represent the accumulated knowledge and spiritual focus of the age. Of course, the vast majority are religious texts, multiple copies of the Bible, commentaries on Scripture by early church fathers like Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great. These are the patristic writings often mentioned, lives of saints, sermons, and texts for performing the divine office in Mass. These form the core collection, the essential tools for monastic life and salvation. But alongside these, you'll find other types of works demonstrating the monastery's broader role as a custodian of learning. There are classical texts, works by ancient Roman authors like Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, Seneca, and sometimes Greek authors like Aristotle or Plato, though often in Latin translation, as knowledge of Greek was less common in Western Europe by the 14th century. These might be works of poetry, philosophy, rhetoric, or history. You might find copies of historical chronicles, detailing the lineage of kings or the history of the monastery itself in the local region. There could be works on natural history, medicine, based largely on ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates, astronomy, often tied to calculating the date of Easter, or even basic arithmetic. It's a mainstream historical fact that without the copying efforts undertaken in monasteries, Particularly during the early medieval period, many of these classical texts would have been lost to us forever during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the subsequent turbulent centuries. They were literally saving antiquity, one painstakingly copied sentence at a time. Imagine them as the world's most dedicated, slowest downloaders. Each book represents an immense investment of time, labor, and resources. Remember that parchment is made from animal skins: sheep, calves, goats. Preparing just one skin was a lengthy process of washing, stretching on a frame, scraping away hair and flesh, and then drying and smoothing. A large Bible could require dozens, even hundreds of skins. Then came the ink, made from soot, gall nuts, or mineral pigments, and the quires, folded sheets, had to be carefully ruled with lines for the text. Copying the text itself was incredibly slow, done with a quill pen made from a goose or swan feather. And then, perhaps, came illumination, the addition of decorated initials, borders, and miniature paintings, often using expensive pigments like lapis lazuli for blue or gold leaf. This could take months or even years for a single large book. Because of this incredible effort in quality, books were incredibly valuable. They were treasures far more precious than almost any other physical possession the monastery owned, perhaps rivaled only by sacred relics or important church plate. Acquiring a new book was a major event, often accomplished through painstaking copying within the monastery's own scriptorium, but also through exchange with other monasteries or through donations from wealthy patrons. A comprehensive library was a mark of prestige and learning, attracting scholars and providing the necessary resources for monks to deepen their understanding of scripture and other subjects. It wasn't just a storage room, it was the engine room of their intellectual and spiritual work. The atmosphere in this library room is one of deep, quiet reverence. Monks would come here to read, study, and meditate on the texts. The scratching of a quill, the soft rustle of parchment pages being turned, the occasional low murmur of a monk reading silently to himself. Reading silently was a skill that developed over time. Often people read aloud, even when alone. These were the sounds of knowledge being absorbed and processed. It's a level of quiet concentration that might feel unnervingly intense to you, used to the constant hum of background noise. Trying to focus like that today, you'd probably find yourself scrolling through TikTok within 5 minutes, right? A quirky detail you might notice is how some books were secured. To prevent theft, and remember these books were worth a fortune, important or frequently used volumes might be chained to the desks or shelves. The chain was long enough to allow the book to be lifted and read, but not removed from the room. This practice, known as chaining, was common in libraries from the medieval period well into the early modern era. Imagine trying to check out a library book today if it was literally chained to the desk. Holds would probably stack up for centuries. The contents of these libraries varied greatly depending on the monastery's size, wealth, and the specific interests of its abbots or leading scholars. Did all monasteries have extensive collections of classical literature? Probably not. Was access to certain philosophical or scientific texts restricted even within the monastery? Possibly. Historians still argue whether the extent of monastic libraries and the breadth of knowledge they contained is sometimes overstated, focusing perhaps too much on the largest and most famous examples, while overlooking the smaller, more limited collections that were likely more typical. What exactly was available to the average monk seeking to expand his learning beyond the strictly religious texts remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. It's not as simple as walking into a university library today and browsing the stacks. Access was likely controlled, prioritized, and very much focused on supporting the primary goal: spiritual growth and service to God. But even with these limitations, the library was undeniably the repository of accumulated wisdom, the physical manifestation of the intellectual continuity stretching back through centuries. It held the words that shaped their faith, the stories that defined their history, and the fragile threads of ancient thought that connected them, however dimly, to worlds long gone. And within these pages, sometimes tucked away or subtly emphasized, lay not just accepted wisdom, but also ideas that could challenge, provoke, and perhaps even endanger the established order. It is the potential presence of these unsettling ideas, hidden amongst the comforting familiarity of Scripture and saints' lives, that begins to set the stage for the strange events to come. So you've explored the physical space, touched or imagined touching the heavy bindings, inhaled the scent of aged parchment and dust. You've seen the collection, a mix of the absolutely essential and the unexpectedly broad. But a library isn't just a static collection of objects. It's a living, breathing entity through the people who use it. In this monastery, that means the monks. Their daily life wasn't solely composed of endless rounds of prayer in the chapel and backbreaking labor in the fields or workshops. A significant, even central part of the monastic calling was the engagement with learning, the deep dive into texts, the cultivation of the inner life through reading and contemplation. This is where the library truly comes alive. Think about a monk's typical day. It's structured by the liturgical hours, periods of communal prayer spread throughout the day and night. But between these services, there were blocks of time dedicated to work, ora et labora, pray and work, as the Benedictine motto goes. And a crucial part of that work was lectio divina, divine reading or sacred reading. This wasn't like speed reading a novel or scanning emails. It was a slow, meditative process, involving reading a short passage of scripture or commentary, then meditating on it, praying about it, and contemplating its meaning. It was meant to nourish the soul, to allow the Word of God to penetrate deeply. Monks would often read aloud, even when alone. In an age before widespread literacy and silent reading was common, sounding out the words helped with comprehension and memorization. Imagine the quiet library room, or perhaps a carrel, a small private desk or cubicle, in the cloister walk near the library, punctuated by the soft murmuring of monks, each engrossed in their text, the words a low, steady hum in the background. It's a soundscape utterly alien to our modern world of earbuds and scrolling feeds. It's a world built on the spoken and the slowly absorbed written word. Beyond lectio divina, there was also scholarly study. While not all monks were scholars, many were, particularly in larger or more prominent abbeys. The monastery was a center of learning. Monks copied text in the scriptorium, a vital task we touched upon, but they also studied them. They learned Latin, the universal language of learning, and the church. They might study grammar, rhetoric, logic, the trivium, and arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the quadrivium. The 7 liberal arts that formed the basis of medieval education, carried forward from classical antiquity. Remember those classical texts in the library? This is where they fit in. The goal of this study, however, was almost always tied to spiritual or practical needs. Learning grammar helped them understand Scripture better. Logic helped them structure theological arguments. Astronomy helped calculate important dates like Easter. History provided examples of virtue or cautionary tales. Medicine offered ways to care for the sick within the monastery and its community. Knowledge wasn't pursued for its own sake in the way it often is today. It was a tool for serving God and understanding His creation. But even within this devout framework, intellectual life wasn't always serene. Monks were people with different personalities, levels of intelligence, and sometimes differing opinions. They debated points of theology, interpreting Scripture, or the writings of the Church Fathers. They discussed philosophical questions, trying to reconcile classical thought, like Aristotle's, with Christian doctrine. These debates could be lively, sometimes even heated. Think of it like your book club, but with eternal salvation on the line, and probably fewer snacks. The library, then, wasn't just a quiet sanctuary, it was also a potential arena of intellectual ferment. The sheer act of copying and preserving texts meant that monasteries held within their walls not just the official, approved doctrines, but also a wider range of ideas, some of which might be old, some new, and some potentially problematic. A quirky detail of monastic intellectual life is the existence of marginalia, notes, doodles, and comments written by monks in the margins of the texts they were copying or reading. These can range from mundane complaints about the cold or the difficulty of the work, "Oh, my hand," to personal reflections, jokes, or even critical comments on the text itself. These marginal scribbles offer fascinating, sometimes humorous, glimpses into the individual minds and daily lives of these medieval scholars and laborers, revealing that even in a highly disciplined environment, human nature and curiosity found ways to express themselves. Imagine leaving passive-aggressive sticky notes in a library book today. Same vibe, just in parchment. The potential for intellectual conflict arose from several sources. One was the sheer diversity of texts preserved. While the core was religious, the inclusion of classical works meant exposure to philosophies and worldviews that predated Christianity or offered alternative ways of thinking about ethics, politics, and the natural world. How do you reconcile Plato's ideas about forms with Christian theology? How do you use Aristotle's logic to understand the mysteries of faith? These were genuine intellectual challenges. Another source of potential friction came from new ideas emerging within the church itself or from outside it. The medieval period was dynamic, not static. New theological schools of thought developed. Universities began to emerge in towns outside the cloister walls, though monasteries often had schools too. And ideas filtered in from other cultures, particularly through contact with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, especially in Spain and Sicily, bringing knowledge of Greek science, philosophy, and medicine. These external influences could be viewed with suspicion. While some scholars actively sought out and translated texts from Arabic or Greek, bringing in works by figures like Aristotle with Arabic commentaries, or the medical writer Avicenna, others were wary of ideas that didn't fit neatly within established Christian doctrine. A mainstream historical fact is that the reintroduction of the full corpus of Aristotle's works into Western Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, often through Latin translations from Arabic, caused a major intellectual stir. His emphasis on reason and the study of the natural world challenged some traditional ways of thinking and required significant effort by theologians like Thomas Aquinas to integrate into Christian philosophy. So within the quiet walls of the library, you had monks diligently copying Augustine on one desk, another carefully studying a medical text based on Galen, and perhaps a younger, more restless mind poring over a recently acquired copy of Aristotle's Metaphysics. This wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about actively engaging with ideas, interpreting them, and sometimes wrestling with them. And this is where things get potentially complicated. What happens when a monk encounters an idea in a book that seems to contradict church teaching? What if a text contains views deemed heterodox or even heretical? What if a secular work is interpreted in a way that seems to undermine monastic discipline or the authority of the abbot? The library, intended as a tool for spiritual growth and the glorification of God, could also become a repository of potentially dangerous thoughts. Historically, monasteries played a complex role regarding controversial ideas. On the one hand, they were pillars of orthodoxy, places where correct doctrine was taught and preserved. They were involved in combating heresy and promoting approved theology. On the other hand, by preserving a wide range of texts and fostering intellectual inquiry, they also inadvertently, or sometimes intentionally, kept alive ideas that were outside the mainstream or that later generations would view critically. Consider the role of debate. While formal disputations were more characteristic of emerging universities, intellectual discussion was part of monastic life. Monks shared their readings, discussed interpretations, and sometimes argued different sides of a theological or philosophical question. This is healthy for intellectual growth, but it also means that potentially unsettling ideas, once encountered in a book, could be discussed, disseminated within the community, and perhaps even gain traction among some members. Historians still argue whether medieval monastic libraries were primarily passive repositories of tradition or active centers of intellectual innovation and potential dissent. Was the average monastery library a dynamic space where a wide variety of ideas were debated, or was it primarily focused on reinforcing established doctrine, with problematic texts either ignored, censored, or kept strictly out of sight? It's likely that the reality varied greatly depending on the specific monastery, its leadership, and the individuals within it. But the potential for unease, for conflicting ideas to surface from the silent pages of a manuscript, was always present. Imagine a monk stumbling upon a text that proposes a radically different interpretation of a key scripture passage, or that questions the established hierarchy of the church. or that simply promotes a more secular way of understanding the world than the monastery usually allows. Such a discovery wouldn't just be an academic curiosity, it could be deeply unsettling, potentially causing spiritual distress, intellectual confusion, and even conflict within the community if discussed openly. The atmosphere in this library, while quiet, carries the weight of centuries of thought, debate, and spiritual striving. It holds the comfort of familiar prayers and approved wisdom, but also, potentially, the seeds of doubt, the echoes of forgotten controversies, and ideas that might challenge the very foundations of their ordered world. It's this hidden potential, this quiet collection of ink on parchment, that will eventually intersect with events outside the monastery walls, leading to a decision that seems drastic, unprecedented, and perhaps, in their eyes, absolutely necessary. The stage is set for the books themselves to become not just tools of salvation, but objects of suspicion. So you've explored the physical space, touched or imagined touching the heavy bindings, inhaled the scent of aged parchment and dust. You've seen the collection, a mix of the absolutely essential and the unexpectedly broad. You've considered the monks who live there, their days shaped by prayer, work, and deep engagement with these very texts. A world both structured and, as we saw, capable of intellectual ferment. But remember, the monastery wasn't an island, sealed off from the world. At least not yet. It existed within a wider, complex, and rapidly changing society. And it was the rumblings and shifts in that external world that would eventually contribute to the fear that led to that drastic act. Imagine stepping outside the monastery walls, leaving the scent of beeswax and ink behind. The 14th century wasn't just a continuation of the static medieval image you might hold in your head. It was a period of significant, sometimes turbulent, change. One of the most visible shifts was the growth of towns and cities. While life in the countryside remained dominant for most people, urban centers were becoming increasingly important. These weren't just clusters of peasants anymore. They were hubs of trade, crafts, and new forms of social organization. Think about the sounds and smells of a medieval town compared to the quiet, ordered life of the cloister. Instead of chanted prayers, you'd hear the clang of the blacksmith, the calls of merchants hawking their wares, the chatter of people speaking vernacular languages, not just Latin, the general hustle and bustle of commerce. The smells would be a mix of bakeries, tanneries, stables, and unfortunately, often less pleasant things due to rudimentary sanitation. It was a different rhythm of life, driven by the market bell rather than the church bell alone. This growth of towns was tied to a changing economy. While land ownership remained a source of power, wealth was increasingly being generated through trade and manufacturing. A new class of merchants was gaining prominence, their influence growing alongside that of the traditional landed aristocracy. These merchants needed literacy, not just for spiritual reading, but for keeping accounts, writing contracts, and communicating across distances. This practical need for reading and writing meant that literacy was slowly spreading beyond the clergy and nobility to a wider segment of the population in urban areas. This rise of a more literate lay population, driven by commerce and civic life, had subtle but important implications. It meant that ideas, news, and even dissenting opinions could circulate more widely than before, even without the formal channels controlled by the church or the monasteries. Merchants traveled, bringing not just goods, but also information and perspectives from other regions. They might encounter different customs, hear new ideas, and even get their hands on written materials that weren't produced in the cloister scriptorium. Alongside this economic and social shift, the intellectual landscape was also changing. For centuries, monasteries had been the primary centers of learning in Europe. They preserved ancient texts, copied manuscripts, and provided education, largely focused on theology and the liberal arts within a religious framework. But beginning in the 12th century and accelerating into the 13th and 14th centuries, a new kind of institution emerged and rapidly gained importance: the university. Mainstream historical fact: the rise of universities like Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and others fundamentally altered the map of European intellectual life. These institutions were different from monastic schools. They weren't tied to a specific abbey and its internal rules. They were often chartered by kings or the Pope and had their own statutes. They brought together masters and students from different places, fostering debate and the systematic study of subjects like law, medicine, and philosophy, in addition to theology. In universities, the dominant method of learning was scholasticism, which involved rigorous logical analysis and disputation to reconcile classical philosophy, especially Aristotle, remember him from the library, with Christian theology. This was a more dynamic, argumentative style of learning than the quiet contemplation of lectio divina in a monastery. While monasteries continued to be centers of learning, the most cutting-edge intellectual developments and debates were increasingly happening in the universities, drawing some of the brightest minds away from the cloister. This created a subtle tension. Monasteries were the keepers of tradition, the preservers of older ways of thinking and copying texts by hand. Universities were the engines of new scholarship, using new methods, sometimes producing texts faster, though still by hand, through professional scribes, and engaging with a wider range of ideas, including those filtered through non-Christian sources. While there was interaction and overlap between monastic and university scholars, their worlds and priorities were distinct. The growing prominence of universities also meant that the church's intellectual authority was being exercised and debated in new arenas. Theology remained the queen of the sciences, but it was being discussed in lecture halls and public disputations, not just in monastic chapters or private study carrels. This more public, sometimes contentious intellectual environment meant that theological and philosophical ideas were potentially subject to wider scrutiny and debate than when they were primarily confined to the cloister. Adding to this sense of a world in flux were growing criticisms directed at the church itself. The 14th century was a time when many people, both lay and clerical, expressed dissatisfaction with various aspects of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. There were complaints about the wealth of the church, the perceived corruption of some clergy, including bishops and abbots, practices like simony, buying and selling church offices, and the general worldly concerns that sometimes seemed to overshadow spiritual duties. Monasteries, often major landowners and recipients of substantial donations over centuries, were not immune to these criticisms. Their wealth, their exemption from certain taxes or feudal obligations, and the comfortable lifestyle enjoyed by some abbots and monks became targets for those who advocated for reform or simply resented the church's power and privilege. This external critique created an atmosphere where the traditional role and authority of monasticism were subtly, or not so subtly, being questioned by people outside their walls. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this changing dynamic. While monks were primarily copying religious and classical texts, the rise of the merchant class led to an increased demand for different kinds of practical literature, manuals on trade, navigation guides, histories written in vernacular languages, even early forms of secular literature and poetry. This showed a diversification of knowledge interests outside the purely spiritual or classical sphere that dominated monastic libraries, reflecting the changing concerns of society. Imagine a monk hearing about someone eagerly reading a book on accounting methods instead of Augustine. It probably seemed very strange and maybe a little alarming to them. Politically, the 14th century was also unstable. The relationship between the Pope, the head of the Universal Church, and the emerging powerful monarchs of Europe was increasingly fraught. Kings like Philip IV of France were asserting greater control over the church within their own realms, challenging the Pope's authority on matters like taxation and legal jurisdiction over clergy. This tension sometimes erupted into open conflict, further undermining the perception of a unified, stable church and creating political uncertainty that affected all church institutions, including monasteries. Historians still argue whether these external changes, the rise of towns and universities, economic shifts, and growing criticisms, represented a fundamental challenge to the medieval order, or were simply new elements being integrated into existing structures. Was the 14th century a period of decline for traditional institutions like monasteries? Or were they adapting, albeit slowly and sometimes reluctantly, to a new reality? It's a complex question, with evidence supporting both sides, depending on the specific region and time period you look at. But regardless of the overall interpretation, it's clear that the comfortable, familiar world in which monasteries had thrived for centuries was shifting. These external pressures didn't just disappear, they seeped into the consciousness of those within the cloister. Monks came from families in this changing society. They might hear news from visitors, from other clergy, or during necessary trips outside the monastery walls. They were aware, to varying degrees, of the criticisms leveled against the church, the political instability, and the new ways of thinking emerging in universities. This growing awareness of a world outside the monastery that was increasingly critical, complex, and unpredictable could easily fuel anxiety within the cloister. If the church's authority was being questioned, if traditional sources of wealth and power were being challenged, if new ideas were circulating that seemed to undermine established doctrine, where did that leave the monks and their way of life? The solid ground beneath them seemed less stable than it once had. The monastery, which aspired to be a place of spiritual refuge and stability, found itself inextricably linked to this turbulent external world. Its economic survival depended on managing its lands and receiving donations from people affected by economic changes. Its intellectual life was now just one stream within a wider, faster-flowing current. Its spiritual authority was facing questioning from both within and outside the church. This external unease created a climate where fear could take root. Fear of change, fear of loss of status, fear of criticism, and perhaps most importantly, fear of ideas that seemed to challenge the very foundations of their faith in their institution. This wasn't just abstract anxiety, it was a growing sense that the world was becoming a more dangerous place, not just physically, but intellectually and spiritually. And where were the tools to understand and combat these perceived dangers stored? In the library, the very place meant to contain wisdom and guide souls now held texts that might be seen through the lens of this external fear. The stage is being set. You have the internal world of the monastery, its routines, its library, its intellectual life, and its potential for encountering challenging ideas. You have the external world, a swirling mix of growing towns, new economies, universities, political tension, and increasing criticism of the church. These two worlds were not separate, they were interacting, and the pressures from outside were creating a sense of vulnerability and anxiety within the seemingly stable walls of the cloister. And that anxiety, that fear, needed something tangible to latch onto, something to blame, or something to control. And as the world outside grew more uncertain, the potential for the contents of the library to be seen not just as sources of wisdom, but as potential sources of danger, grew with it. The murmurs of discontent in society were slowly, subtly becoming whispers of suspicion directed towards knowledge itself. So the external world was churning, right? Towns were growing, money was talking louder, universities were buzzing, and criticisms of the church were becoming less like polite murmurs and more like, well, actual complaints you couldn't ignore. You felt this unease pressing in on the monastery walls, a sense that the familiar, ordered universe was coming a little bit undone at the seams. But those weren't the only pressures. The 14th century decided, apparently, that merely being dynamic wasn't enough. It needed to throw in some truly catastrophic, terrifying events to really spice things up. And spice things up it did, in the way that throwing a grenade into a teacup would spice things up. Let's start with the big one, the absolute heavyweight champion of 14th century trauma, the Black Death. It arrived in Europe in the mid-1340s, sweeping across the continent with terrifying speed and lethality. Imagine you're a monk in this monastery, maybe around 1348 or 1349. News is coming in, first as vague, horrifying rumors from port cities, then closer, reports of entire villages decimated, of people dropping dead within days of showing symptoms. You might hear about ships drifting ashore with no one alive on board, or carts piled high with bodies in the nearest town. It's an enemy you can't see, can't fight with swords or logic, and that strikes seemingly at random. The mortality rate was staggering. Estimates vary, but it's widely accepted that somewhere between 30% and 60% of Europe's population died in just a few years. Think about that. Half the people you know, gone. Your family members back home, gone. Fellow monks in the cloister, gone. The baker who brought the monastery bread, gone. It wasn't just individuals, it was the fabric of society being ripped apart. Labor was suddenly scarce. Traditional hierarchies were disrupted, and the sheer, overwhelming grief and fear were constant companions. Trying to keep up with burying the dead was a logistical nightmare, let alone performing the proper rites. Imagine the smell, even just outside the walls, if it reached your area. Ugh. For people living through this, it wasn't just a disease, it was often interpreted as a divine punishment. Why else would something so indiscriminate and devastating happen? This interpretation fueled intense religious fervor for some, flagellants wandering the land, whipping themselves publicly to atone for their sins, and profound questioning and doubt for others. If God was unleashing this plague, what did it mean? Was the world ending? Had the church failed? Was this punishment for something specific? This climate of fear, guilt, and apocalyptic anxiety saturated everything, including the monastery. Within the cloister, the Black Death could be particularly devastating. Monastic life involves communal living, which is terrible for containing contagious diseases. Monks cared for the sick, performed last rites, and buried the dead, exposing themselves constantly. Many monasteries lost large numbers of their members, sometimes entire communities wiped out or reduced to a handful. The carefully built structures of religious life, dependent on a certain number of hands for chores, prayers, and copying manuscripts, were shattered. A scriptorium that once had 10 active scribes might suddenly have 2. An abbot, prior, cellarer, and infirmarian might all die within weeks. It was chaos and profound loss. Now connect this back to the library. In a world reeling from such inexplicable horror, where did you turn for understanding? For comfort? For answers about divine judgment and salvation? The library held the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the theological treatises, the interpretations of Scripture, the lives of saints. But did it contain the right answers for this level of crisis? If the established prayers and penitential practices weren't stopping the plague, maybe something was wrong with the understanding derived from these books. Or maybe more terrifyingly, some of the books contained ideas that had angered God and brought this upon them. This era of plague sowed fertile ground for suspicion and radical thinking. Mainstream historical fact. The Black Death's impact wasn't just demographic. It had profound social, economic, and psychological consequences across Europe, fundamentally altering the late medieval world and weakening the authority of many traditional institutions, including aspects of the church. But the plague wasn't the only source of anxiety. The 14th century also saw major crises within the leadership of the church itself. Remember how the Pope's authority was being challenged by kings like Philip IV of France? Well, that tussle led to the Pope moving the papal court from Rome to Avignon in what is now France, starting in 1309. This period, known as the Avignon Papacy, lasted for about 70 years, sometimes called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy by its critics, comparing it to the Israelites' exile in Babylon. While the popes in Avignon were legitimate from a canonical perspective, their residence there under the strong influence of the French monarchy was deeply unsettling to many. It seemed wrong, a betrayal of Rome's historical and spiritual significance. It fueled accusations of corruption, worldliness, and being overly subservient to French interests. You had 2 sets of cardinals, one in Rome and one in Avignon, and things got really messy. Things went from messy to outright catastrophic in 1378 when the Western Schism began. After the return of the papacy to Rome, a disputed papal election resulted in 2 men claiming to be the legitimate pope, one in Rome, one who eventually returned to Avignon. Later, there was even a period with 3 competing popes. Imagine the confusion and despair. Your spiritual leader, the supposed vicar of Christ on earth, the ultimate authority on matters of faith and salvation, was uncertain. Which one did you obey? Which one could offer true absolution? For monks whose entire lives were structured around serving all and the church hierarchy, this was profoundly disorienting. Your abbot might side with the Roman Pope, while a neighboring monastery supported the Avignon Pope. Kings and political powers across Europe lined up behind one claimant or the other, often for political reasons, further blurring the lines between spiritual truth and worldly power struggles. It was an existential crisis for the institutional church, and by extension, for those within it. This schism amplified existing criticisms of clerical corruption and the church's wealth. If the popes themselves were behaving like squabbling politicians, living in luxury while Christendom was ravaged by plague, what did that say about the whole system? Where did you find spiritual certainty in a world where even the highest spiritual office was contested and seemingly tainted by worldly concerns? This uncertainty could easily spill over into how texts were viewed. If the ultimate interpreters of doctrine were themselves suspect, maybe their interpretations in the texts they relied upon needed closer scrutiny. Or maybe the problem wasn't the texts themselves, but the way they were being used or ignored. Doubt in the leadership could easily translate into doubt about the established ways of understanding faith, which were, of course, largely based on the contents of the library. Adding another layer to this volatile mix were the stirrings of what would later become major heresies. While figures like John Wycliffe in England or John Hus in Bohemia are more prominent later or elsewhere, the 14th century saw earlier movements and individuals questioning aspects of church doctrine and practice. These weren't just marginal figures. Some were academics, former clergy, or influential preachers whose ideas gained traction among lay people, disillusioned with the established church. These emerging heresies often focused on areas like the authority of the Pope, the nature of the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, the role of the clergy, and the importance of Scripture in vernacular languages. Ideas like the priesthood of all believers or challenging the necessity of intermediaries between God and man struck at the heart of the church's structure and the clergy's unique status. From the perspective of the monastery, these were dangerous, potentially soul-destroying ideas. Heresy wasn't just a different opinion, it was seen as a fundamental error that could lead people to eternal damnation. It was a spiritual plague, potentially more insidious than the Black Death. And where might these dangerous ideas come from? They could be preached by wandering friars, sometimes seen as rivals to monks, spread through conversations in towns, or more worryingly, derived or supported by misinterpretations of existing texts. Imagine the fear. Could a seemingly innocuous text in the library, maybe a philosophical work or an obscure theological argument, be twisted or misunderstood in a way that fed these dangerous ideas? Could the very tools of knowledge, the books they were sworn to preserve and study, become vectors for spiritual infection? The external threat of heresy made the internal contents of the library seem potentially risky. A quirky tidbit related to the fear of heresy in books. During this period, the practice of physically mutilating or destroying books deemed heretical became more common. This wasn't just about stopping the spread of ideas. It was a symbolic act of purifying the intellectual landscape and destroying the physical vessel of spiritual error. Sometimes this involved burning, other times scraping out passages, or even tearing pages. The idea that books could be physically dangerous, needing destruction, was in the air. Furthermore, the 14th century was rife with social unrest and conflict. Peasant revolts, like the Jacquerie in France or the Peasants' Revolt in England, both later in the century, erupted periodically, often fueled by economic hardship after the plague, resentment of noble or clerical privilege, and a general sense of things being fundamentally unjust. Monasteries, as large landowners, were often direct targets of peasant anger and violence. Their wealth and tax exemptions made them symbols of the very power structures the rebels despised. Wars were also constant. The 100 Years' War between England and France began in the mid-1330s, ravaging large swaths of the French countryside where many monasteries were located. Armies, whether your own side or the enemy, were often undisciplined and prone to looting, pillaging, and violence against civilians and church institutions. Monasteries were relatively wealthy targets, and their isolation could make them vulnerable. Living with the constant threat of war, banditry, and social upheaval added another layer of fear and insecurity. The strong walls of the monastery offered some protection, but not immunity, and this external violence could feed into a general sense of societal breakdown, reinforcing the idea that the world was becoming a more dangerous, unpredictable place, where established rules and orders were breaking down. Historians still argue whether these crises Plague, schism, heresy, war, social unrest caused a fundamental crisis of faith among the general population, or merely intensified existing anxieties and spurred calls for reform within the church? Did people stop believing, or did they simply become more critical of the institution and its leaders? It's likely a mix of both, varying greatly from person to person and region to region. But what is undeniable is that the cumulative effect of these events created an environment of profound fear, uncertainty, and a search for scapegoats or solutions in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. For the monks, isolated in their cloister, yet acutely aware of the chaos outside through travelers, visitors, and news, this turbulent external world was deeply unsettling. It challenged their faith, their understanding of God's plan, the authority they relied on, and even their physical safety and economic stability. The external crises amplified their internal anxieties. In such a climate, the library, the repository of knowledge and wisdom, could easily be reevaluated. What if some of the knowledge wasn't wisdom at all, but error? What if certain books contained ideas that were subtly undermining faith, contributing to the very heresies and doubts that were rampant outside? What if misinterpreting certain passages led to behaviors that angered God and brought the plague? When you are afraid, truly deeply afraid of forces you can't control, sickness, divine wrath, social collapse, spiritual error, you look for something you can control. And within the monastery walls, amidst the chaos, the library represented a controllable space. Its contents, its arrangement, its access, these were things the monks could potentially manage, perhaps in a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that felt completely out of their grasp. The fear generated by the external crises began to focus inward, landing on the most potent and potentially dangerous thing within their direct control: the books themselves. The library, once a sanctuary of learning and piety, was becoming a place viewed with increasing apprehension. The lines between orthodox wisdom and dangerous knowledge seemed blurrier in the dim, plague-ridden light of the 14th century. The world outside wasn't just noisy and dynamic, it was terrifying. And the monastery, like a ship in a storm, felt the full force of the waves. Sealing the library was perhaps a desperate attempt to batten down the hatches against a tempest that was both external and, increasingly, felt internal, threatening the very soul of the community. You felt the tremor of that external chaos right here, inside these supposedly quiet walls. The plague, the schism, the whispers of new dangerous ideas circulating out there, they didn't just stay outside. They seeped under the doors, through the cracks in the stone, carried on the wind and the worried faces of visitors or returning brothers. And as those external anxieties mounted, as the world seemed to tilt precariously on its axis, the focus of fear began to shift. Subtly at first, then with increasing intensity, towards the very heart of the monastery's purpose, its knowledge, towards the library. Remember how I mentioned the established order was under pressure? The Pope's authority fractured, kings challenging the church, social hierarchies strained to breaking point by mass death. In such a world, the bedrock of certainty felt shaky. And if the traditional interpreters of truth were in question, the Pope in Avignon or Rome, the bishop who sided with one over the other, then what about the sources of that truth? What about the books themselves? This wasn't just a vague worry, it was a very specific, deeply ingrained fear in the medieval mindset. The fear of spiritual error, of heresy. Heresy wasn't just an academic disagreement, it was seen as a contagious disease of the soul, a path leading straight to eternal damnation. And where did these soul plagues originate? Often it was believed from misinterpreting scripture, from following false prophets, or from ideas contained in texts that seemed innocuous but were, in fact, spiritually poisoned. Imagine you're a monk, dedicating your life to prayer, study, and copying sacred texts. Your salvation and the salvation of those around you depends on clinging to true doctrine. But now, the air outside feels thick with doubt and dissent. You hear reports of people questioning the sacraments, challenging the authority of priests, even suggesting that the church's wealth is an affront to God. These are seismic, terrifying ideas. And your immediate thought might be, where are these ideas coming from? Could they be lurking within our own walls? Within our own books? The library, which was meant to be a sanctuary of divine and human wisdom, could suddenly start to feel like a potential breeding ground for spiritual infection. A manuscript that had been copied centuries ago, perhaps a philosophical treatise or a commentary on scripture from a less well-known theologian, might suddenly be viewed with suspicion. Did it contain arguments that, in retrospect, seemed to echo the dangerous ideas now circulating? Could a seemingly harmless passage be twisted or misunderstood in a way that led a weaker brother astray? This wasn't entirely new, of course. The church had always had a system for identifying and condemning heresy, and certain books had been banned or burned before. But the scale of the crises in the 14th century, particularly the schism, meant that the lines between orthodoxy and potential error felt incredibly blurry. Who was the ultimate authority to judge a text if the ultimate earthly authority, the Pope, was duplicated or disputed? It was like trying to navigate a minefield with two different, contradictory maps. Wait, did the Roman Pope condemn this interpretation or the Avignon one? Does it even count if the other one approved it? My head hurts. The anxiety grew because the stakes were infinite. It wasn't just about being wrong, it was about risking damnation, both for yourself and potentially for others who might read these texts. If you, as a guardian of the library, knew a book contained something that could lead someone to heresy, wasn't it your duty, a sacred duty, to prevent that? Even if you weren't entirely sure? The uncertainty amplified the fear. Better safe than eternally sorry, right? Though in this case, safe might mean depriving yourself of knowledge. Furthermore, the medieval worldview often didn't neatly separate disciplines like we do today. Theology, philosophy, science, such as it was understood, medicine, astrology, they were all often intertwined. So a text that might be primarily philosophical could contain theological implications that were now viewed as suspect. A book on the natural world might contradict interpretations of creation found in Scripture, leading to concerns about its spiritual safety. It was a holistic fear where intellectual error could easily slide into spiritual peril. Think about the process of copying texts, which was a core activity in many monasteries. You would sit for hours meticulously transcribing words onto parchment. But now, as you copied, a nagging doubt might creep in. Were these the true words? Had there been errors introduced over centuries of copying? Or worse, were the original words themselves flawed or dangerous? Every letter, every phrase could become an object of intense scrutiny and potential anxiety. It added a layer of stress to an already arduous task, making you wonder if you were contributing to the spread of light or accidentally opening Pandora's box. Copying a recipe for terrible medieval beer might have felt like a spiritual relief compared to transcribing complex theological arguments. This era also saw an increased emphasis on controlling access to certain types of knowledge. As literacy slowly grew, especially among the merchant class and in universities, the church became more concerned about who was reading what and how they were interpreting it, particularly Scripture. The idea of Scripture in the vernacular, which later became a major point for reformers, was already viewed with suspicion by some who felt lay people or even unlearned clergy might misinterpret its complex truths without proper guidance. The library, as the repository of authoritative texts, became a focal point for this control. You can imagine the discussions within the monastery. Brothers arguing over the merits of a particular commentary. The abbot receiving nervous letters from the local bishop about heresies reported in nearby towns. The weight of responsibility pressing down. Was it better to risk having a potentially dangerous book, hoping no one would be led astray, or to lock it away just in case? Given the climate of fear and the perceived cosmic stakes, eternal damnation, locking it away might start to seem like the responsible, even pious choice. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this climate, while not solely focused on libraries, the intensification of the Inquisition's activities, particularly in areas grappling with heresy like southern France, though less active than in previous centuries, the institutional framework, and fear it remained, reflected the broader church's determination to root out and control dissenting thought. The very existence of such a powerful institution dedicated to policing belief certainly contributed, to an environment where monks would feel pressure to ensure their own intellectual house was in order. You didn't want the inquisitor knocking on your monastery door asking uncomfortable questions about the contents of your scriptorium. The types of texts causing concern weren't always obviously heretical. Sometimes it was philosophical works that seemed to give too much weight to human reason over divine revelation, or texts on astrology that seemed to suggest the stars held sway over divine will. Think about the reception of rediscovered classical text. Aristotle, for example, was immensely influential, but some of his ideas about the eternity of the world or the nature of the soul seemed to clash with Christian doctrine. Scholarly debate arose about how to reconcile faith and reason, but in a time of heightened anxiety, simply possessing or studying a text that contained potentially conflicting ideas could feel risky. There was also anxiety about texts from other religious traditions or even obscure Christian sects from the past. Did your library hold copies of arguments made by long-condemned heresies, perhaps copied centuries ago before their danger was fully recognized? Were there texts brought back from crusades or travels that contained information about Islam or other faiths that could be viewed as corrupting? The sheer volume and diversity of the medieval library meant there was a lot of material that could, in a fearful climate, be interpreted as potentially problematic. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this. Medieval manuscripts sometimes contain marginalia, notes in the margins, where a scribe or reader has added comments directly refuting a point made in the main text, essentially arguing with the book itself. In this period, you might find marginal notes that aren't just clarifying, but actively condemning a passage, labeling it as erroneous or dangerous. It's like someone live tweeting their disapproval of a historical text, only with quill and ink. And the potential consequence being not just being ratioed, but actual spiritual peril. Imagine writing, this is heretical garbage next to a theological argument. Historians still debate whether the intellectual restrictions and anxieties of this period stifled genuine scholarly inquiry, or if they merely channeled it into avenues deemed acceptable by the church. Did the fear of heresy prevent monks from exploring new ideas? Or did it force them to become more rigorous and subtle in their theological arguments, finding ways to reconcile seemingly conflicting ideas within an orthodox framework? There's no simple answer, and it likely varied greatly depending on the specific monastery, the abbot's disposition, and the particular intellectual interests of the brothers. But for your monastery, facing the combined pressures of plague, schism, and the growing external and internal fear of heresy, the sheer potential for danger within the library's walls became a very real concern. It wasn't just about protecting valuable manuscripts from physical harm. It was about protecting souls from spiritual harm. The fear was that the books themselves could be vectors for spiritual disease, spreading doubt and error just as the plague spread sickness. This fear was amplified by the feeling of losing control over the external world. The plague was unstoppable. The political maneuvering of popes and kings felt beyond their influence. Social unrest was unpredictable and violent. But the library? The library was within their control. They were the guardians of its contents. If they couldn't fix the world outside, maybe they could at least ensure the purity and safety of the knowledge within their immediate sphere. Locking away questionable books felt like a concrete action they could take in a world where most actions felt futile against overwhelming forces. Think about the weight of that responsibility. Every book, every scroll, represented not just information, but potential spiritual power. For good or ill, the decision to keep or remove a text wasn't just administrative, it was freighted with immense spiritual significance. Was this commentary divinely inspired wisdom, or a subtle trap laid by the devil? Was this philosophical text harmless contemplation, or a gateway to doubt? The inability to be absolutely certain was, in itself, a source of profound anxiety. The process of identification would have been fraught. Who decided a text was dangerous? Titus, the abbot, a council of senior monks? Did they rely on lists of condemned books issued by higher authorities, which during the schism might be confusingly issued by competing authorities? Or did they make their own judgments based on their reading and theological understanding? This internal process would have created tension and debate within the community. Brother Thomas might argue a text was a harmless philosophical exploration, while Brother John saw clear paths leading to heretical conclusions. Honestly, Thomas, did you even read the part about the prime mover? It's basically paving the way for people to believe in gas and natural causation. The physical act of sealing the library when it happened wasn't just about putting a lock on a door. It was a symbolic act. It represented an attempt to create a barrier, not just against thieves or external disturbances, but against the insidious spread of dangerous ideas that were felt to originate or at least be housed within those walls. It was an admission that the guardians of knowledge were now afraid of the knowledge itself. This isn't to say the monks were ignorant or anti-intellectual. Far from it. Their lives were devoted to study. But the crisis of the 14th century forced a reevaluation of what constituted safe, salvific knowledge in a world that seemed to be collapsing. The fear wasn't of knowledge per se, but of knowledge gone wrong, of wisdom twisted into error, of truth becoming heresy. And in a time of overwhelming uncertainty, the perceived risk associated with certain books became too high to bear. So the decision to seal the library wasn't just a practical measure, it was a spiritual and psychological response to a world gone mad. It was an attempt to purify their intellectual space, to quarantine potentially infectious ideas, and to protect themselves and their community from what they saw as spiritual danger emanating from within their own cherished collection. The fear of the books was a direct consequence of the fear of the external world, amplified and internalized. They looked at the library, once a source of light, and saw the potential for shadow. So that simmering fear we talked about, the one that saw potential heresy lurking in every dusty corner of the library, couldn't just stay as a vague, unsettling feeling. Fear, especially in a monastery where structure and rules were paramount, demanded action. It demanded control. If the outside world was uncontrollable chaos, then their inner world, their sanctuary of knowledge, had to be made safe, purified. And purification, in this context, meant implementing layers of control, ratcheting up the security, long before anyone even considered putting a final, definitive seal on the doors. Imagine the discussions in the chapter house. Hushed tones, worried brows. Brother Michael found a passage in the commentary on Isaiah that seems to question the Immaculate Conception, Abbot. Has anyone properly reviewed the copy of Pseudo-Dionysius? I heard whispers it contains Neoplatonic ideas that could be problematic. The air would have been thick with suspicion, fueled by the anxieties of the plague and the schism. Every monk, from the most learned to the humblest novice, was now a potential guardian, and potentially a nervous watchdog. The first, most logical step in tightening control would be a rigorous, almost fearful re-examination of the library's contents. This wasn't just a routine inventory to see which scrolls were crumbling. It was a theological and philosophical audit. It was like going through your email inbox after a security breach, suddenly suspicious of every single message, even the ones from Grandma. Except the stakes were eternal damnation, not just a phishing scam. They would likely have initiated a process of detailed cataloging, but with a new anxious lens. Existing catalogs, if they had them, and many larger monasteries did, would be reviewed. Were they detailed enough? Did they just list titles and authors, or did they include descriptions of content? Perhaps they started adding notes, contains commentary on Aristotle, includes astrological charts, discusses the nature of grace, needs careful review. This wasn't just administration, it was the creation of a watch list. Every entry would be scrutinized. Is this author known to be entirely orthodox? What sources did they use? What are the potential interpretations of this text? Think about the sheer physical labor involved. Hauling heavy manuscripts, unrolling brittle scrolls, poring over dense Latin script under flickering candlelight, all while carrying the mental burden of judging the spiritual safety of the words within. Your back aches, your eyes strain, and your mind races with theological anxieties. Is this sentence okay? Or does it subtly undermine free will? Oh God, what if I'm misinterpreting it and condemning a perfectly fine book? It was intellectual work layered with spiritual dread. This recataloging effort would have been slow, painstaking, and likely incomplete. The library was vast. Remember, it was significant for its time. There were texts in various states of decay, texts whose authorship was uncertain, texts copied with errors over centuries. Trying to definitively label everything as safe or risky was an impossible task, which, of course, only heightened the anxiety. The very uncertainty was part of the problem. If you couldn't be sure a book was safe, maybe it was safer to assume it wasn't. Following the inventory and fearful recataloging came the restriction of access. The open door policy, if one had ever truly existed, access was always somewhat controlled, would have ended. Entry to the library might now require explicit permission from the abbot or the prior. Perhaps only senior trusted monks were allowed in, deemed more theologically robust and less likely to be led astray. Junior monks eager to learn might find themselves suddenly shut out from vast swathes of knowledge, allowed access only to approved basic texts deemed spiritually milk rather than potentially poisoned meat. Imagine being a young, intellectually curious monk, excited by the prospect of delving into ancient philosophy or obscure theological debates, only to find the door to that knowledge suddenly locked, or a stern senior telling you, that book, oh no, brother, that's complicated. Best stick to the Gospels for now. Frustration and perhaps a different kind of fear, the fear of ignorance, would have set in. But the prevailing fear was of spiritual contamination, and in that climate, limiting exposure felt like a necessary precaution. Access might also have become stratified. Some sections of the library deemed less problematic, perhaps the books of hours, psalters, basic biblical texts, the writings of universally accepted church fathers like Augustine or Jerome, might remain relatively accessible. But other sections, philosophy, non-Christian texts, anything even remotely controversial, perhaps older texts whose origins were unclear, would be placed under tighter lock and key. Separate chests, locked cupboards within the library itself. Physical barriers mirroring the intellectual anxiety. Then came the difficult, agonizing process of identifying specific texts for removal or isolation. This wasn't a decision made lightly. These books were often beautiful objects, painstakingly copied and represented accumulated wisdom. But the fear of their potential harm outweighed their value as mere physical objects, or even sources of potentially dangerous ideas. What criteria were used? Known heretical authors. Any texts attributed to individuals or groups previously condemned by the church, like the Cathars or early Gnostics, or followers of specific philosophical heresies. Texts challenging authority. Anything that questioned the Pope's power, the hierarchy of the church, or the validity of sacraments. Texts contradicting doctrine. Philosophy or science that seemed to directly contradict established theological truths, like Aristotle's idea of an eternal world conflicting with creation ex nihilo. Texts from other religions. Writings on Judaism, Islam, or pagan philosophy viewed not just as different, but potentially corrupting or containing dangerous errors. Texts with errors. Surprisingly, sometimes texts were deemed problematic simply because they contained too many copying errors. This could be seen not just as sloppiness, but as potentially distorting the original true meaning, and thus leading people astray. It's like saying a blurry low-res photo of a religious icon is spiritually dangerous because you can't quite make out the details. Once identified, these books weren't necessarily burned immediately, though that happened elsewhere. Here the focus seems more on containment. They were more likely removed from the general collection, packed away in separate chests, perhaps stored in a less accessible part of the monastery, like a treasury vault, or even a forgotten cellar. Segregated, quarantined, out of sight, out of mind, and crucially, out of the hands of potentially susceptible readers. Imagine the scene, monks carefully, perhaps sadly, lifting heavy volumes, wrapping them in cloth, carrying them down winding stone stairs to a dark, damp room. Each book placed in a chest felt like a small death, a severing of a link to knowledge, but also perhaps a small act of salvation, protecting the community from unseen spiritual peril. The creak of the chest lid closing, the thud as it was locked, sounds heavy with responsibility and fear. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the gradual development of lists of prohibited books within the church. While the formal Index Librorum Prohibitorum came much later, 16th century, the concept of identifying and suppressing texts deemed dangerous or heretical was present throughout the Middle Ages. Various church councils and individual bishops or popes would condemn specific works or authors. These local monastic efforts to remove books were part of this broader evolving tradition of intellectual control and censorship driven by concerns about maintaining doctrinal purity. They were implementing, on a micro level, practices that existed at a macro level. This process of selection and removal must have been fraught with difficulty and internal debate. One monk's profound philosophical treatise was another's dangerous gateway to heresy. The criteria weren't always clear-cut, and interpretations of texts varied. Who was qualified to make these judgments? Did they rely on external pronouncements, which during the schism might be conflicting, or did they try to apply their own theological understanding, risking error themselves? There would have been resistance too, even if quiet. Monks who were genuinely dedicated scholars, who saw value in philosophical inquiry or understanding other cultures, would have resented seeing valuable texts locked away or removed. They might have argued for the importance of studying these texts to refute their errors rather than simply suppressing them. But in a climate dominated by fear and a conservative instinct to protect souls, the voices arguing for caution and containment likely won out. It's hard to argue for open inquiry when people are whispering about eternal hellfire just down the hall. A quirky or fringe tidbit about medieval manuscripts is the practice of expurgation. Instead of removing an entire book, sometimes scribes or later censors would cross out or erase specific words, sentences, or even entire paragraphs deemed problematic within an otherwise acceptable text. You can find manuscripts where lines have been drawn through passages, sometimes with a note like "vacat," it is empty, or a brief explanation of why it was removed. This is like trying to censor the internet by drawing a line through offending words on your screen, leaving the rest of the page visible but scarred. In this monastery's process, they might have initially tried expurgation before deciding full removal was necessary for some texts. Just cross out that bit about the universe being eternal, Brother Giles. No, wait, the whole chapter seems dodgy. Just put it in the bad box. Historians still debate the extent to which these measures, both at the monastic level and the broader church level, actually succeeded in preventing the spread of dissenting ideas. Did locking away books truly stop monks from encountering these concepts through other means? Conversations with travelers, discussions with scholars from outside the monastery, or even through less controlled texts? Or did it simply create a black market for forbidden knowledge, making these restricted ideas even more alluring? It's possible that attempting to suppress certain texts inadvertently drew more attention to them or fostered a quiet resentment that manifested in other ways. Consider the practical challenges: ensuring all copies were found, preventing monks from secretly accessing the restricted areas, dealing with texts that were only partially problematic. It was an ongoing, exhausting effort, requiring constant vigilance. The library, instead of being a place of peaceful contemplation and study, became a site of anxiety and policing. This heightened security, this fear-driven cataloging, the restricting of access, the selective removal of texts, these weren't just administrative changes. They were symptoms of the deep spiritual and intellectual crisis gripping the monastery. The books, once seen primarily as vessels of truth and tools for salvation, were now viewed with suspicion, potential carriers of spiritual disease. The library, once a source of light, was perceived to contain shadows that needed to be contained. But these measures, while significant and disruptive, ultimately proved insufficient. The fear wasn't fully alleviated by simply moving some books or locking a few chests. The external pressures didn't disappear, and the internal anxieties persisted. The very difficulty and potential incompleteness of this process likely reinforced the feeling that the threat was pervasive and hard to control. If they couldn't be sure they had found all the dangerous books, if they couldn't completely prevent access, then the threat remained. This escalating sense of an uncontainable intellectual and spiritual danger, despite the measures taken, built towards a more drastic, more absolute solution. A solution that went beyond restriction and removal towards total, albeit temporary, isolation. The decision to seal the entire collection was born out of the failure of these preliminary steps to fully quell the pervasive fear that the knowledge itself had become too dangerous to live with. It wasn't just about some books being risky, it was the potential for risk lurking anywhere within those walls that ultimately drove the final dramatic action. You've gone through the meticulous process, haven't you? You felt the dust on your hands, squinted at the fading ink, wrestled with the thorny theological questions these books posed. You've helped identify the suspects, moved the potentially dangerous volumes to segregated storage, maybe even tried scratching out the most egregious lines, like a medieval editor wielding a very pointy quill. You locked chests, you restricted access, you tried every logical, incremental step to contain the perceived infection within the library walls. And yet, the fear, that cold, creeping dread, didn't just linger. It intensified. Think of it like a bad cough that just won't go away. You try cough drops, you try tea, you try ignoring it, but it just gets worse, settling deep in your chest, making it hard to breathe. The monastery's fear wasn't just about a few problematic coughs. It felt like a full-blown, contagious pneumonia threatening to choke the spiritual life out of the entire community. Every hushed conversation about a questionable passage, every worried glance toward the library door, every sermon that seemed to subtly warn against intellectual pride or the dangers of too much inquiry, it all fed into the growing sense of panic. The partial measures failed because the source of the anxiety wasn't just specific books. It was the potential for danger inherent in knowledge itself, or at least in unchecked, unsupervised, and potentially misinterpreted knowledge during a time of profound instability. The Black Death had shaken their understanding of God's favor in the world's order. The papal schism had fractured the very foundation of church authority, making it harder than ever to know who to trust, which pronouncements were truly authoritative. In such an environment, the library, a repository of centuries of thought and debate, could easily be seen not just as a source of truth, but also a breeding ground for error, doubt, and ultimately, heresy. The logic, twisted by fear and desperation, became something like this. If even the most learned among us might misinterpret these complex texts, if even the most vigilant cannot guarantee that every dangerous idea has been identified and isolated, and if access cannot be absolutely restricted without knowing who might be susceptible to spiritual contagion, then the only surefire way to protect the community is to sever contact entirely. It's the ultimate form of quarantine, not just isolating the sick, but isolating the entire environment where the sickness might lurk, because you just can't be sure where it is. This line of reasoning, born of exhaustion and a sense of overwhelming powerlessness, would have culminated in a moment of heavy decision-making. Imagine the chapter house again. The abbot, his face etched with worry, calls the senior monks together. The air is thick with tension, not just from the spiritual anxieties, but from the sheer weight of the practical problems. The endless cataloging that feels futile, the arguments about which book is truly dangerous, the quiet murmurs of fear spreading among the younger monks. Someone, perhaps the librarian who is now less a curator and more a reluctant jailer, or maybe a particularly anxious elder, would have voiced the unthinkable. Abbot, venerable brothers, we have tried, we have sorted, we have removed, we have restricted, but the uncertainty remains. How can we be sure? How can we sleep at night knowing that within these walls, accessible to potentially anyone, are words that could damn a soul? Words that could sow doubt, words that question the very pillars of our faith, especially now when the world outside is already crumbling? The silence that followed would have been deafening. The suggestion hangs in the air, radical, shocking, and yet in the fevered atmosphere of the time, perhaps terribly logical. Seal it, lock it all away. Don't just remove the bad apples. Seal the entire barrel because you suspect the rot has spread everywhere. It's an act of intellectual surrender, yes, but presented as an act of spiritual preservation. The debate wouldn't have been easy. Monks who had devoted their lives to study, who saw the library as the heart of the monastery's intellectual and spiritual life, would have recoiled. Seal the library? But Abbot, it is our treasure. It contains the wisdom of the fathers, the holy scriptures, the commentaries that guide our understanding. How can we study? How can we learn? How can we teach? Arguments would have flown, the value of knowledge versus the safety of souls, the historical role of monasteries as custodians of learning versus the immediate need to protect against perceived spiritual threats. The practical implications. How would they conduct their studies? How would new monks be educated beyond the basics? What about texts needed for daily services or theological reflection? It wasn't like you could just Google scripture verses or download a digital copy of Aquinas. Books were unique, precious, and often irreplaceable. But the voice of fear, amplified by the external crises, was persuasive. The argument would return to the core anxiety, the uncertainty. Yes, brother, it contains great treasures. But what if, nestled amongst those treasures, are poisons we cannot detect? What if, in our current confusion, we lack the discernment to use these complex tools safely? The risk to eternal souls is too great. Our primary duty is to protect the flock, not to preserve intellectual pursuits that may lead us astray. This decision was fundamentally paradoxical for a medieval monastery. Monasteries, particularly like the one this story is woven around, a fictional construct representing a very real historical type, were islands of learning in a turbulent world. They preserved texts, copied them, studied them, and debated them. Their libraries were often their most prized possessions, symbols of their wealth, their intellectual rigor, and their connection to the accumulated wisdom of Christianity and antiquity. To deliberately close off this vital organ was an act of institutional self-harm, a severe amputation driven by the belief that the body was infected. Think about how much this went against the monastic grain. Monks took vows of stability, obedience, and poverty, yes, but implicit in their calling was a dedication to prayer, work, and study. Lectio Divina, sacred reading. The library was the engine room of study. Sealing it was like a baker deciding to lock up his oven because he's worried about someone baking something blasphemous. It kneecapped a core function of their existence. A mainstream historical fact that resonates strongly here is the heightened concern over heresy throughout the Middle Ages, and particularly in the 14th century. While the Albigensian Crusade and the formal Inquisition had addressed some major movements earlier, anxieties about Lollardy in England, Hasidism brewing in Bohemia, and other dissenting voices across Europe, combined with the fracturing of church authority during the schism, created a climate ripe for suspicion. It wasn't just theoretical. Real people were challenging church doctrines, and the church, or rather competing claims to leadership within the church, responded often with severe measures. This monastery's actions, though local, were a microcosm of this broader panic about doctrinal purity and intellectual control. They were living in a world where ideas were perceived as dangerous weapons, and they felt they were disarming themselves by locking up the arsenal. The decision once made would have been ratified by the abbot in the chapter. It wasn't a sudden, impulsive act, but the endpoint of a long, agonizing process driven by escalating fear and failed attempts at control. It represented a collective admission of defeat. Defeat in their ability to discern truth from error. Defeat in their confidence in their own understanding, and defeat in their capacity to manage the intellectual challenges of their time while grappling with overwhelming external pressures. Now imagine the practicalities. The library isn't just a single room, it might be several rooms, perhaps on different floors, connected by narrow staircases. How do you seal it? Not just lock the door. Sealing suggests something more permanent, more definitive. Boards nailed across windows, stone walls built across doorways, mortar applied to cracks. It speaks of a desire for a physical barrier that mirrors the intellectual isolation they were imposing. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to medieval monastic life that might lend color here. Monks in many orders, especially those following stricter rules, often had incredibly regulated lives, down to the hour of prayer, the amount of food eaten, and even the approved topics of conversation. This rigid structure was designed in part to minimize distractions and temptations, including potentially wandering thoughts or exposure to problematic ideas. The decision to seal the library fits, in a perverse way, into this monastic impulse towards strict control and removal of potential sources of spiritual peril, just writ very, very large and applied to the source of their own learning. It's like deciding that since casual chatter can lead to gossip and potentially sin, the safest thing is just to stop talking entirely outside of prayer. Historians still argue whether this extreme act of sealing an entire library was a unique event or if similar measures, perhaps less well documented, were taken by other communities during times of acute crisis or ideological panic. Was this an isolated incident, a symptom of exceptional local circumstances, and a particularly fearful abbot? Or was it merely one of the most visible examples of a broader, but often hidden, practice of monastic communities reacting to external threats by attempting to impose absolute internal intellectual control, even at the cost of their own tradition of scholarship? Without more surviving records, it's difficult to say definitively if this monastery was an outlier or just the one we happen to know about because of later events that led to its eventual rediscovery. The act of sealing wasn't just about bricks and mortar or locks and keys. It was a symbolic act of profound significance. It declared that the knowledge within was too dangerous to be interacted with, too potent to be managed. It was an admission that the very tools they used for salvation and understanding had, in their eyes, become potential instruments of damnation and confusion. You can almost feel the shift in the monastery's atmosphere after the decision was made. A grim determination, perhaps, mixed with sadness and a lingering sense of unease. The physical world outside was chaotic and threatening, and now their carefully curated inner world, their sanctuary of texts, was being walled off, turned into a tomb for knowledge. The silence in the library, once a contemplative silence of study and copying, would become the heavy, absolute silence of abandonment. The next steps would be the practical and likely arduous process of implementing the seal, gathering the materials, hiring or assigning the labor, physically blocking entrances and windows. Each stone laid, each board nailed, would represent another layer of insulation from the feared contagion of ideas. It wasn't just about denying access. It was about making access physically difficult, a barrier that required significant effort and intent to breach. They weren't just putting up a "do not disturb" sign. They were building a vault. This sealing wasn't intended to be permanent, at least not initially. It was a temporary measure, a spiritual quarantine until the storms passed, until authority was reestablished, until the air felt safer to breathe. But as we know, temporary measures born of fear often have a way of becoming long-lasting, sometimes even permanent, especially when the fear persists or the reasons for the sealing become lost to time and changing circumstances. The intention was likely to reopen the doors someday, but the act of sealing itself created a physical and metaphorical barrier that would prove incredibly difficult to dismantle. The library wasn't just closed, it was made inaccessible, a sleeping giant locked away, its potential for good and ill alike neutralized behind stone and silence. The decision hung in the air, heavy and final, after that intense meeting in the chapter house. You could feel the shift immediately. The air didn't just hum with the usual monastic routine of prayer and work. There was a new underlying tension, a grim energy that felt mission alien here. The abbot, having made the agonizing choice, would have immediately directed the prior or another senior monk to begin the preparations. This wasn't just about bolting a door. This was about physically walling off a substantial part of the monastery's structure, and you needed materials, planning, and manpower. Imagine the logistics. First, assessment. Which rooms exactly constituted the library? Was it a single, large space, or a series of chambers built and expanded over decades? You'd have to identify every single point of entry. The main doorway, sure, but also any smaller service doors, windows, even high ones, and perhaps even passages that might connect to other parts of the building complex. Medieval monasteries were often sprawling, organically grown structures, not precisely planned modern buildings, so this initial survey might have turned up some unexpected access points. Wait, brother, is that a window hidden behind that old tapestry? We'll need to board that up too. Then came the gathering of materials. Stone wasn't just lying around ready to go. It needed to be quarried, shaped, and transported. Wood for beams and boards would need to be cut, planed, and measured. Mortar, that crucial binding agent, had to be mixed from lime, sand, and water, or a messy, time-consuming process. This wasn't like popping down to B&Q for a bag of cement and some 2x4s. Everything was labor-intensive and required skilled hands, or at least hands willing to learn quickly under stern supervision. Who would do the work? The monks themselves, certainly as part of their manual labor obligations, but depending on the scale of the library, it might have been too much for the community or alone, especially with their rigorous schedule of prayer and other duties. It's quite possible they'd hire lay brothers or even external laborers from the nearby village or town. Imagine the scene. Monks in their habits working alongside rough-looking men in simpler tunics, all under the watchful eye of the monastic overseer, perhaps adding a new layer of social friction to the already tense atmosphere. Mind you don't drop that stone on Brother Thomas's foot, Giles. He's got vespers to attend. The work would have begun, slowly at first, then perhaps with increasing urgency as the fear drove them forward. You'd hear the unfamiliar sounds echoing through the cloister, the rhythmic chipping of stone masons, the grating of saws on wood, the dull thud of hammers, the splashing as mortar was mixed, the grunts of men lifting heavy loads. These sounds, so different from the quiet routines of reading, copying, and prayer, would have served as a constant, grating reminder of what was happening, a soundtrack to the ceiling. Think about the doorways first. These weren't just simple openings. Medieval doors were often thick, made of heavy planks, sometimes reinforced with iron. To seal them permanently wouldn't just mean locking them, it would mean building a wall in front of them. Stone would be laid layer by layer, mortared into place, effectively bricking up the entrance. This would be done on the outside, preventing any entry. Perhaps they'd even build the wall on the inside as well, creating a sealed cavity, doubly isolating the space. Windows presented their own challenges. Small, high windows might be boarded up with heavy planks, nailed firmly into the stone or wooden frames. Larger windows, especially if they contained valuable leaded glass, unlikely for a simple library window but possible, might be carefully removed and then the opening walled up. Even tiny ventilation slits, intended to prevent the books from molding, might be deemed too risky and filled in with stone or mortar. The goal was absolute enclosure, leaving no crack or crevice where a curious eye, or worse, a wandering thought, could slip through. The process itself would have been physically demanding and emotionally draining. You might have been assigned to haul stones, your back aching by the end of the day. You might have mixed mortar, your hands raw and coated in the gritty paste. You might have been on scaffolding, working high up to board a window, the wind whipping around you, the library growing darker and more inaccessible below. Every swing of the hammer, every stone placed, felt like a physical manifestation of the monastery's fear in its desperate attempt to regain control in a world that felt increasingly uncontrollable. A mainstream historical fact here is that significant construction projects, even within monasteries, were often undertaken using a mix of internal monastic labor and skilled lay craftsmen. While the monks were expected to contribute physical labor as part of their discipline, complex tasks like quarrying stone, detailed masonry, or intricate carpentry often required expertise they didn't possess. This blended workforce was common across medieval building projects, from cathedrals to castles to, yes, monasteries. So it's historically plausible that our fictional monastery would have brought in outside help for such a large-scale sealing operation. The sealing wasn't just about blocking access, it was also about silencing the space. The library, while not a place of loud chatter, had its own sounds. The rustle of parchment, the soft turning of pages, the quiet murmuring of a monk reading aloud during Lectio Divina, the gentle scratching of a scribe's quill. If they had a copying scriptorium integrated, though libraries were often separate, with the sealing, those sounds would cease. The space would become profoundly silent, a silence broken only by the sounds of the sealing itself. And once the work was done, that deep, heavy silence would remain, a constant reminder of the absence within. The transition from a working library, however restricted, to a sealed tomb of texts would have been jarring. The monks who regularly used the library for study, for reference, for copying, their routines would be shattered. Where would they get the texts they needed for sermons, for theological debates, for personal study? They might have a small collection of essential liturgical books and perhaps some commonly used biblical commentaries elsewhere. But the vast repository of knowledge was now locked away. It's like a baker closing his main pantry and saying, well, you can still use the sugar bowl on the counter, but that's it for now. The rationale, I remember, was protection. They weren't trying to destroy the books, though some might have wished they could. They were trying to protect themselves from the books and the potential danger they represented in this turbulent era. The physical barrier was a metaphor for the intellectual isolation they were imposing upon themselves. No new ideas could get out, but also no old wisdom could easily get in. They were drawing a protective circle, and the library was on the wrong side of the line. The initial silence after the sealing would have been profound. You'd walk past where the library door used to be, now just a blank wall of fresh stone, and feel a strange emptiness. The space that was once a source of light, knowledge, and connection to centuries of thought was now just a silent, impenetrable block. The monastery would feel smaller, its intellectual horizons abruptly narrowed. Daily life would continue, prayers, chores, meals, sleep, but an essential heart had been deliberately stopped. Consider the psychological impact. For monks who had entered the order partly for the opportunity for study and intellectual growth, this was a devastating blow. Their access to the tools of their trade, to the wells of wisdom they were expected to draw from, was gone. There might have been quiet resentment, unspoken questions. How could they deepen their understanding of Scripture without access to the great commentaries? How could they prepare learned sermons? How could they engage with the theological challenges of their time if they were cut off from the vast body of Christian thought? It's like telling a doctor they can no longer access medical journals or talk to other doctors. Their practice would suffer immensely, a quirky or fringe tidbit that adds flavor to this era. Medieval building practices, while impressive in scale, often relied on knowledge passed down through generations of craftsmen rather than formal blueprints or engineering diagrams as we know them. They had an intuitive understanding of materials and forces, but methods could vary significantly from one region or workshop to another. The mortar they used, for instance, while effective, wasn't always as uniformly strong as modern cement, and its quality could depend heavily on the source of the lime and the skill of the mixer. So while the monks might have aimed for a permanent, impenetrable seal, the reality might have been slightly less perfect than intended, perhaps leaving tiny structural weaknesses or variations in the wall that a keen eye might eventually notice centuries later. It wasn't quite DIY, but it wasn't always precision engineering either. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for such extreme measures was theological panic rooted in fears of heresy or social panic, exacerbated by the Black Death and political instability, or a complex interplay of both. Was the sealing a response to specific, known problematic texts, or a general overwhelming fear of the potential for any knowledge to be misinterpreted and cause harm in such uncertain times? The nature of the external crises, plague, schism, certainly heightened anxieties about God's judgment and the reliability of human institutions, making a retreat into perceived spiritual safety, however drastic, seemed logical to some. The immediate aftermath of the sealing would have been a period of adjustment. The routines that involved the library, periods of silent reading, the copying of manuscripts, consultations for difficult questions, were simply erased from the schedule. What replaced them? Perhaps more manual labor, more prayer, or perhaps just an awkward void. The silence where the library stood would have been a constant presence, a physical manifestation of a difficult choice. Think about the sheer volume of text now inaccessible. If the library held hundreds or even thousands of volumes, a significant collection for the time, imagine trying to function without them. It would be like trying to run a modern university without access to the internet or its physical library collection. You could get by on basic textbooks and notes for a while, but serious research, deep learning, and engagement with complex ideas would become almost impossible. The hope, perhaps, was that this was a temporary measure. Once the schism was healed, once the immediate terror of the plague receded, once theological certainty felt more solid, maybe then they could unseal the library, assess its contents with clearer eyes, and reintegrate it into monastic life. But putting up a wall is much easier than taking one down. The physical effort required to reverse the process would be significant, and the psychological barrier, the memory of the fear that drove them to seal it in the first place, would be even harder to dismantle. This act of sealing wasn't merely pragmatic, it was symbolic. It was a public declaration within the monastery's walls that knowledge itself could be dangerous, that control was paramount, and that in times of crisis, spiritual safety trumped intellectual pursuit. It created a physical boundary around a perceived intellectual hazard. The library became a kind of reliquary of dangerous potential, locked away not to preserve holy bones, but to contain volatile ideas. And as the mortar dried and the silence settled, the library wasn't just closed, it became a forgotten entity, removed from the living memory and daily practice of the community it once served. The dust would begin to settle not just on the sealed doors and windows, but on the manuscripts themselves, beginning their long, silent slumber within the darkened walls. The raw, physical labor of the sealing finished, leaving behind a different kind of silence. Not the quiet hum of study or prayer, but the absolute dead quiet of a space removed from the living world. You stand there, maybe running a hand over the rough, newly mortared stone where the familiar library door used to be. It's cool and unyielding, a stark barrier replacing the warmth of polished wood and the welcoming smell of old paper. The sounds of construction, the chipping, sawing, hammering, fade, replaced by the sounds that were always there but now feel amplified in the absence of the library's life. The distant chanting from the chapel, the clatter of pots in the refectory, the wind whistling around the cloister corners. Inside those newly built walls, the library is plunged into a state of perpetual night. Windows, its few connections to the outside world, and the light that filtered in, have been boarded or walled up. The faint glow that once illuminated the lecterns and highlighted the vibrant colors of illuminated manuscripts is gone. Darkness is absolute, thick enough you might imagine to taste. It settles over the wooden shelves, blankets the books on their spines, and creeps into the narrow spaces between parchment leaves. This isn't just inconvenient darkness, it's an environment hostile to the preservation of delicate materials. Without ventilation, the air becomes stagnant, heavy, and potentially humid. Dampness, a constant enemy of parchment and ink, could begin to creep in, perhaps seeping through tiny imperfections in the old walls or rising from the stone floors. Think about finding a box of old papers in a damp basement after years. The musty smell, the warped pages, maybe even the beginnings of mold. Now imagine that on the scale of hundreds, perhaps thousands of precious volumes, sealed away from light and air. The books themselves, the very reason for this drastic action, now sit in their silent tomb. They are no longer vessels of living knowledge, consulted, debated, copied, and learned from. They are artifacts, frozen in time, their voices muted. The beautiful calligraphy, the intricate initial letters, the detailed miniature paintings, all hidden from view, their colors slowly fading in the blackness. The ink, once vibrant, might begin to flake, the parchment to yellow and become brittle. Silverfish, bookworms, larvae of various beetles, and other pests which thrive in dark, undisturbed conditions might begin their slow, relentless work, tunneling through pages, devouring bindings, turning knowledge into dust. It's a morbid thought, isn't it? The very wisdom they sought to control and contain is now slowly decaying, being consumed by insects in dampness, lost to the inevitable forces of entropy. It's like preserving a valuable antique by burying it in a swamp. The intention was protection, but the reality might be slow destruction through neglect and unsuitable conditions. The library becomes a physical void within the monastery's layout. You can no longer pass through its doors, glance through its windows, or hear the faint sounds of study. It's just there, a block of stone, a sealed-off space. For the monks, especially those who spent significant time within its walls, this void must have felt palpable. Their routines were disrupted, their sources of information gone. They had to adapt, relying on memory, on the few books they might have in their personal cells, or the common liturgical books in the chapel. It's like suddenly having your internet access cut off and realizing how much you relied on being able to look things up instantly. Imagine trying to research a sermon on a complex theological point without any reference texts. You'd be improvising, relying on shared oral tradition or patchy personal notes. Over time, the mental void would likely follow the physical one. The memory of the library, of its layout, its smell, the specific locations of frequently used books, would begin to fade for younger monks who never knew it open. For older monks, the memories might remain, tinged with regret or resignation. But the space itself becomes something abstract, a part of the building we sealed off. It's no longer the library, it's just the sealed section. The reasons for the sealing, the specific texts or ideas that spark such fear, might also become less distinct in the collective memory, morphing into a general cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled knowledge in unstable times. Ah yes, the library, a senior monk might say to a novice, gesturing vaguely towards the sealed wall. We had to close it for safety. Too much. Thinking, perhaps. Best stick to the fundamentals. This gradual forgetting isn't felt malicious. It's a natural human response to a space that is no longer part of daily life. Out of sight, out of mind, amplified by the psychological need to justify the extreme measure they took. You don't dwell on something you've consciously rejected and walled off. The sealed library becomes a kind of architectural scar, a permanent reminder of a crisis moment and the difficult choices made. A mainstream historical fact that resonates here is the practice of walling up or sealing sections of buildings, sometimes permanently, sometimes temporarily, for various reasons in the medieval period. This wasn't only done for libraries. Sections might be sealed off during outbreaks of disease to quarantine the sick, or after deaths, or even just to abandon parts of a building that had become structurally unsound or inconvenient. Castles, for instance, often show evidence of passages, doorways, or even entire wings being walled up over their long histories. So the act of sealing off a section was within the realm of medieval building practices, even if applying it to a library was unusual. Think about the symbolism. A library is meant to be a place of light, access, in the free flow of ideas across time and space. By sealing it, the monks transformed it into the opposite, a place of darkness, inaccessibility, and stagnation. It became a tomb for knowledge, interring not bodies but the very essence of intellectual life. It suggests a deep-seated fear, not just of specific dangerous ideas, but of the potential for knowledge itself to disrupt the established order, especially when that order felt fragile and threatened. The silence inside is profound. No footsteps, no voices, no rustling pages. Only the slow, inexorable work of time and decay. The air grows heavy with the scent of aging parchment, dust, and perhaps the telltale musty odor of dampness and mold. Any light filtering in through tiny cracks or settling dust motes dancing in unseen beams would highlight the static nature of the scene, the untouched shelves, the motionless books. This sealing represents a turning inward for the monastery. They are rejecting external influences, cutting themselves off from the broader intellectual currents of their time. They are retreating into their own perceived safe space, defined by stricter rules and a more rigid interpretation of their beliefs. The library, with its diverse collection that might have included works from various schools of thought, different historical periods, and perhaps even non-Christian sources, like classical philosophy, which was often studied alongside theology, represented a potential gateway to ideas that challenged their desire for internal uniformity and control. It's a powerful metaphor for censorship, isn't it? Not burning the books, which is active destruction, but passive containment. The books aren't annihilated, but they are rendered inaccessible. effectively removed from circulation, their influence neutralized by imprisonment rather than incineration. It's a slower, perhaps more insidious form of control. You can almost hear the whisper of dust settling on the forgotten spines. A quirky or fringe tidbit, medieval libraries sometimes had elaborate security measures even when open, not necessarily because the ideas were considered dangerous, but because the books themselves were incredibly valuable objects. Manuscripts were handmade, often beautifully illuminated, and the materials, parchment, ink made from ground minerals or plants, gold leaf, were costly. Some monasteries chained their books to the desks, literally. Imagine having to stand to read a heavy manuscript chained to a wooden lectern, a far cry from lounging on a comfy sofa with a paperback. So a certain level of control and security around books wasn't unprecedented, but sealing an entire library went far beyond simple preservation or theft prevention. Historians still argue whether the intention behind sealing was purely punitive/fear-driven or also contained an element of preservation, a desperate attempt to shield valuable text from potential confiscation or destruction by external forces like warring factions or heretical movements. Perhaps they reasoned that a hidden library was safer than an open one in such tumultuous times, even if the sealing itself put the books at risk from internal decay. Was it a clumsy act of protection or a deliberate act of intellectual suppression? The motives of people living through extreme crises are rarely simple or singular. The monks who had intellectual pursuits as their primary calling within the monastery would have felt this loss most acutely. The intellectual life of the community would inevitably shrink. Conversations would become less informed by broad reading, sermons perhaps less layered and nuanced. The focus would shift, perhaps, to more rote memorization, more inward contemplation, based on a smaller, approved set of texts. The monastery risked becoming intellectually impoverished, trading breadth of knowledge for perceived spiritual safety. Think about the weight of that silence pressing down on the rest of the monastery. Every time you walked past that section of wall, you were reminded of the books, the knowledge, the questions, and perhaps even the fears locked away inside. It was a constant, silent presence, shaping the atmosphere of the place. The monastery was no longer just a place of prayer and work. It was also a place of deliberate suppression, of chosen ignorance of a past sealed off. The sealed library becomes a kind of ghost limb for the community, a part that is physically there but no longer functional, no longer felt in the daily rhythm of life. It's a heavy weight, a reminder of the world outside that they have chosen to shut away. The ideas they have decided are too dangerous to confront. And as the years turn into decades and the decades into centuries, the initial reasons might blur, the fear might lessen, but the wall remains. The silence remains. The slow decay within continues undisturbed, marking time in the darkness. The forgotten knowledge waits, patient and silent, behind the stone. The knowledge, sealed away behind stone, doesn't just sit there in silent decay forever. Oh no. While it's true that light and air are gone and the slow work of damp and pests begins its process, something else starts to happen outside that sealed wall. As the initial crisis fades, as the specific political pressures lessen, and as the memory of the original concrete reasons for sealing, those precise texts, those specific fears of heresy or rebellion, begin to blur in the minds of the monks, especially the younger ones who weren't there. The void becomes a canvas for imagination. You see, the sealed wall, this silent barrier, becomes a mystery. Why exactly was it sealed? The official line might persist for a while, a general dangers of certain books, but specifics get lost. Over generations, the lack of access, the sheer unknowability of what's behind that wall, breeds something potent. Legends. Humans, as you know, absolutely despise a vacuum of information. If you don't give them the facts, they will cheerfully invent something far more interesting, often tinged with fear, wonder, or outright fantasy. So, whispers begin. At first, maybe it's just curious novices asking older monks, what's in there? The answers might be vague, hushed. Forbidden books, they might say, eyes wide. Texts that caused trouble. Trouble is a wonderfully flexible word, isn't it? It can mean anything from a mild theological disagreement to sparking a peasant revolt or summoning minor demons. The ambiguity is the perfect breeding ground for exaggeration. The legends don't just appear overnight. They grow like moss on a damp stone wall, slowly, organically, adding layers over time. A story about a particularly controversial manuscript becomes a story about a book so powerful it could drive men mad. A rumor about the monetary value of the collection transforms into tales of hidden gold or jeweled bindings stored inside alongside the texts. The darkness and silence within become attributes of the library itself, turning it from a storage space into something almost sentient, brooding, or malevolent. You might hear tales whispered in the cloister after Vespers, or perhaps shared during manual labor, away from the direct supervision of the abbot. They say, a young monk might murmur, shoveling manure in the abbey gardens, that the books in there aren't us written, but speak. That's why they had to seal it. The voices, they wouldn't stop. Another might add, my great-uncle, who was a monk here, said he once saw a strange light flickering from under the old door before it was sealed, even though all the lamps were out. These aren't rational accounts. They're stories born of mystery and fear. They tap into the universal human fascination with the forbidden, the unknown, and the possibility of something extraordinary hidden just out of reach. The sealed library becomes the monastery's own private enigma, a source of both unease and a kind of thrill. It's like that locked room in an old house you were told never to go into as a kid. The plain fact that it was off limits made it infinitely more interesting than any room you were allowed to enter. Some legends might focus on the sheer danger of the contents. Perhaps the books contain spells for necromancy, detailed instructions for brewing poisons, or philosophical arguments so convincing they could shatter a monk's faith. Remember how the original fear might have been about political instability or challenging the church's authority. These specific worries morph into more fantastical dangers in the legends. The risk isn't just dissent anymore, it's damnation, chaosm, or corruption on a spiritual level. They say, the story goes, that one book describes how to open a gate to elsewhere. Cue dramatic pause and wide eyes. Other stories might be simpler, focusing on the physical space itself. Maybe the sealed section is said to be unnaturally cold, even on the warmest day. Or perhaps strange scratching sounds are sometimes heard from within the wall late at night. These tales reinforce the idea that the space is not just empty, but actively different, holding on to something that doesn't want to be contained. It's the medieval equivalent of saying a place is haunted. This tendency for places and objects associated with intense events or mysteries to become the subject of folklore is a mainstream historical fact, not limited to medieval monasteries. Throughout history, places of power, sites of tragedy, ancient ruins, or unexplained phenomena quickly accumulate layers of story, superstition, and myth. Think of Stonehenge, the Bermuda Triangle, or even local haunted houses. The lack of complete understanding or the presence of an unexplained element invites narrative creation. The sealed library, with its deliberate enclosure and hidden contents, is a perfect candidate for this process. The legends serve multiple purposes within the monastic community. They reinforce the magnitude of the decision to seal the library, justifying the extreme measure by portraying the contents as profoundly dangerous. They provide entertainment in a shared sense of mystery, and perhaps, subconsciously, they allow the monks to process the loss of their library by transforming it into something awe-inspiring and terrifying, rather than simply a resource they can no longer use. It's easier to live without something if you can convince yourself it was inherently perilous anyway. You might hear tales of monks who tried to peer through cracks or listen at the wall, only to be struck by sudden illness or plagued by disturbing dreams. These stories act as cautionary tales, reinforcing the taboo around the sealed space. Leave well enough alone, the message is clear. Some doors are meant to stay shut. It's human nature to test boundaries, but these legends provide a supernatural or dire consequence to curb that curiosity. Consider how these stories might change depending on who is telling them and who is listening. A stern senior monk might use them to instill discipline and fear of forbidden knowledge in novices. Younger monks might share them with a mix of genuine fear and nervous excitement. People outside the monastery, hearing fragmented accounts, might weave even wilder tales, perhaps involving the monks in secret, dark practices related to the sealed books. The why of the sealing becomes less important than the what's in there now. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this is the historical fascination with cryptic inscriptions or hidden messages left behind in old buildings. Sometimes these are just builder's marks or prayers, but often folklore assigns them deeper, magical, or ominous meanings. If the sealed library had any carved stone or hidden passages elsewhere in the building that were linked to it, you can bet stories would emerge about cryptic warnings or clues left by the last monks who were inside. Maybe a weird symbol etched near the former door, or a strange arrangement of stones in the wall itself, would become interpreted as a protective ward or a sign of the darkness within. Historians still argue whether the extent of such legendary buildup around specific incidents like this was a deliberate tool used by authorities, like the abbot, to control behavior, or if it was a more organic, bottom-up phenomenon of folklore creation driven by the community's own psychological needs and fears. Was the abbot subtly encouraging the scary stories to ensure compliance? Or were the monks just scaring themselves silly in the dark corners of the cloister? It's hard to know for sure, as evidence for deliberate manipulation is scarce, while evidence for widespread superstition is not. The sealed library, then, exists simultaneously as a physical reality, a walled-up room slowly succumbing to decay, and a mental construct, a place of potent legends and fearful speculation. The actual books might be molding and crumbling, their specific heresies and controversial arguments fading into illegibility, but the idea of them, the mystery of them, grows larger and more powerful in the collective imagination. Think about how much energy goes into speculating about things you can't see or know for sure. Online forums dedicated to conspiracy theories, discussions about unexplained phenomena. It's the same basic human drive. The monks, deprived of their library, turned their intellectual energy, or perhaps just their idle chatter, towards inventing its hidden life. It's less productive than scholarship, certainly, but arguably more compelling from a storytelling perspective. And as the centuries pass, and the monastery itself perhaps changes hands, or the order's rules shift, the original context of the sealing becomes even dimmer. The legends, however, might persist, becoming entwined with the history of the building itself. Visitors centuries later might be shown the wall, and the accompanying tale isn't about 14th century political theory or theological debates, but about a cursed library filled with unholy power, sealed away by brave monks to protect the world. The reality that it was likely a pragmatic, though perhaps misguided and ultimately destructive, response to a complex socio-political crisis involving difficult-to-control ideas is far less exciting than the legend of the forbidden grimoires and whispering walls. So the legends endure, shaping how the sealed space is perceived long after its original purpose, and contents are forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians, and maybe not even them. The silence within the sealed library is absolute, but the silence outside around the wall is frequently broken by whispers. Whispers of fear, whispers of wonder, whispers of the unknown. The stone wall doesn't just separate the books from the monks, it separates historical fact from burgeoning myth, creating a space where imagination thrives in the absence of light and knowledge. And as you stand by that wall, in your mind's eye, you can almost hear the faint echo of those whispers, weaving tales around the dark, forgotten heart of the monastery. So you've heard the whispers, felt the lingering chill of the legends around that sealed wall. The human mind, left to its own devices with a mystery, will inevitably conjure wonders and horrors far grander than mundane reality. But let's pull back from the realm of myth for a moment. Let's think about something more concrete, something you can hold in your hand, something that might survive the centuries. Physical evidence. Imagine, if you will, that centuries have passed since that stone wall was built. The monks are long gone. The abbey might be a ruin, a museum, a repurposed building, or perhaps just a forgotten pile of stones in a quiet valley. But the wall remains. Maybe it's just a section of thicker masonry, a slight difference in the stonework that tells you something is different here. Or maybe, if the legend persisted, a later owner or explorer marked the spot, adding to the mystery. When archaeologists, or perhaps just very curious historians with permission and funding, a rare combination, let me tell you, eventually come to investigate, they won't be relying on spooky stories whispered in the dark. They'll be looking for clues etched in stone, buried in the earth, or hidden in the forgotten corners of the surviving parts of the building. Their first step wouldn't be to immediately bash down the wall, tempting as that might be. No, responsible investigation starts outside. They'd examine the wall itself. Is the masonry different from the rest of the building? Does it show signs of being built quickly, maybe even sloppily, suggesting urgency? Or is it a carefully constructed, permanent barrier? Look for any external features. A small, sealed-up window, a blocked doorway, any symbols carved into the stone near the seal. Sometimes medieval builders or residents would leave marks, mason's marks, protective symbols, even prayers. And these could offer hints, though interpreting them centuries later is its own puzzle. They'd also meticulously excavate the area immediately outside the wall. Was anything deliberately buried there? Perhaps objects associated with the books, or tools used in the sealing process, or even symbolic items meant to ward off the dangers within. Finding something as simple as a rusted hinge or a specific type of nail could confirm there was once a door there, providing context for the wall. Or maybe they'd find evidence of a small, temporary fire pit used by the builders during the sealing work. Little scraps of charcoal telling a quiet story of that day. Beyond the immediate wall, the search expands to the rest of the monastery grounds, if any still exist. Are there any surviving records? Account books, chronicles, letters? These are gold mines. Even if they don't explicitly mention Project Seal the Scary Books, they might contain oblique references. Maybe there's a sudden, unexplained expenditure on stone and mortar around the time the library was sealed. Or perhaps letters from the abbot to superiors mention difficulties with certain volatile materials, or necessary measures to preserve order and piety. Reading between the lines of medieval documents requires a special kind of patience, like trying to decode your teenager's text messages, but infinitely more rewarding when you succeed. What about other surviving books from the monastery? Remember, they didn't seal everything. The books they kept and used might hold clues. Look for marginalia, those little notes, scribbles, and drawings monks made in the margins of texts. Sometimes these are just doodles or personal reminders, but sometimes they reference other texts, mention discussions or debates, or express opinions that might indirectly point to the controversies swirling around the sealed library. Imagine finding a note in a theological text that says, "Brother Thomas argued the contrary, citing that book," with a vague gesture implied pointing towards the forbidden wing. Goosebumps, right? You might find unexpected items elsewhere in the ruins that hint at the monastery's activities during that period. Maybe unusual scientific instruments, or texts on topics not typically found in monastic libraries, or even evidence of attempts to reproduce or hide information before the sealing. If the sealed books were about, say, advanced optics or botany that challenged prevailing thought, finding discarded lenses or strange plant presses elsewhere could connect the dots. It's like finding a single odd piece of a puzzle in a completely different box. It tells you the puzzle isn't just what you initially thought it was. A quirky or fringe tidbit here is the practice of book curses, elaborate or simple maledictions written into books to deter thieves or borrowers. While not evidence of sealing, finding such a curse in a surviving book from that monastery, perhaps one with a particularly dramatic wording, "May he who steals this book be cooked in the fires of hell," could give you insight into the general attitude towards protecting or restricting access to knowledge within that specific community. If they were that protective of everyday texts, imagine the measures they'd take for books deemed truly dangerous. It shows a culture where the physical safety and control of text was a significant concern. Now let's indulge the curiosity that legends provoke. What if, after centuries, someone does finally breach the wall? Imagine the dust motes dancing in the first beam of light that pierces the ancient darkness. The air would be thick, heavy with the smell of damp, decay, and old paper. It's not going to be like opening King Tut's tomb, all pristine and golden. This is a tomb for ideas, and ideas don't preserve well in neglected medieval buildings. The scene inside would likely be one of quiet devastation. Shelves might have collapsed under the weight of the books and the relentless pull of gravity over centuries. Books would be piled on the floor, pages fused together by damp, bindings gnawed by rodents, ink faded or leached away. The sheer amount of organic material, parchment, paper, leather, glue, would have been a feast for mold, insects, and whatever other small creatures managed to find their way in through tiny cracks over time. But even in decay, there are clues. The state of decay itself tells you something. If the books are utterly destroyed by damp, it suggests the sealed room wasn't completely watertight or climate controlled. Surprise, medieval buildings weren't HVAC marvels. If there's evidence of fire, it could hint at a desperate, last-minute attempt to purify or destroy contents, perhaps failed before the room was sealed. The types of insects or fungi present can even provide data points about the environmental conditions inside over the centuries. The arrangement of the surviving remnants is crucial. Are the books neatly stacked on the floor as if shelves collapsed? Or are they jumbled in a way that suggests they were thrown in hastily? Was there any attempt to protect them, wrapped in cloth, stored in chests? Finding empty chest fragments or waterlogged bundles could indicate intent, even if the protection failed. This tells you about the manner of the sealing. Was it a planned, albeit extreme, preservation attempt or a panicked reaction? And then, the glorious, heartbreaking possibility, finding identifiable texts. Even a water-damaged, mold-encrusted fragment of a page can be analyzed. What script is it in? What language? Are there any recognizable illustrations or illuminations? Can the text itself be deciphered, even partially? Finding specific authors, titles, or topics, say a collection of works by a known heretical writer, or treatises on alchemy that went beyond acceptable practice, or politically seditious pamphlets, would provide the most direct evidence for why the library was sealed. Imagine finding a book with a title page still legible, The Unvarnished Truth About Papal Power, followed by an author known for getting excommunicated. That's a pretty big hint right there. Or perhaps finding multiple copies of the same controversial text, suggesting it was a hotbed of that particular dangerous idea. Beyond the books themselves, what else might be inside? Did the monks leave anything behind when they sealed it? Tools, personal items, a note? Finding a set of calligrapher's pens in an ink pot could suggest scribes were working right up until the sealing. Finding a monk's personal crucifix or a worn prayer book might hint at their state of mind during the process, perhaps a sense of dread or solemn finality. Even finding something as mundane as a broken stool or a discarded piece of cloth could contribute to the picture of that final day before the wall went up. Evidence of attempts to make copies elsewhere might also be found within the sealed room. Stacks of parchment or paper, leftover ink, preliminary sketches for illuminations that were never finished. This would suggest that the contents weren't just being stored or hidden, but actively used or copied before the drastic decision was made. This adds another layer to the why. Maybe the sealing was a response to the spread of these ideas, not just their presence. The mainstream historical fact here is the fundamental principle of archaeological stratigraphy and context. Where you find something, the layer it's in, and what it's found with, is often as important as the object itself in understanding its history and purpose. A book fragment found on a shelf tells a different story than one found stuffed hastily under a floorboard, or one found within a sealed lead box inside the room. The context helps interpret the artifact. Historians still argue whether archaeological evidence alone, particularly from complex sites like monasteries with long histories and multiple phases of building/use, can ever definitively prove the intent behind an action like sealing a library. You can find the wall, you can find the moldy books, you can find clues about the contents, but proving with absolute certainty why the people at the time did it, without clear written testimony from them, remains a subject of interpretation and debate. Was it fear, preservation, hiding from enemies, political compliance, a specific religious decree? The material remains can only take you so far in uncovering motivations. This adds to the ongoing fascination. The sealed library isn't just a physical space, It's a historical cold case. And like any good cold case, the evidence is fragmented, ambiguous, and open to multiple interpretations. Every scrap, every stain, every nibbled corner of parchment is a potential clue, waiting for a historical detective to piece it together. Think of it like trying to figure out why your roommate sealed off their half of the fridge after that unfortunate incident with the week-old mystery meat. You can look at the passive-aggressive note they taped up, the barricade of cereal boxes, the type of tape they used, but you still might not fully grasp the depth of their trauma unless they actually tell you about the smell. In the case of the medieval monks, they built a wall and left no explanatory note on the outside. So the investigation becomes a process of inference, deduction, and careful reconstruction. It's about understanding the time period, the specific monastery, the known controversies, and then seeing how the physical evidence aligns, or doesn't, with the potential explanations. Did they find evidence of forbidden astronomical charts? That might support theories about intellectual heresy. Did they find texts advocating for peasant rights? That points towards political fears. Did they find strange diagrams alongside alchemical texts? That leans towards fears of prohibited magic. The sheer volume of lost knowledge is also part of the archaeological story. What percentage of the library survived the sealing and the subsequent decay? Often only fragments remain, tantalizing glimpses of lost wisdom or dangerous ideas. This highlights how precarious the survival of information was in the pre-modern world, subject to deliberate destruction, accidental loss, and the simple ravages of time and environment. So while the legends provide a dramatic, imaginative answer to the mystery of the sealed library, it's the slow, painstaking work of archaeology and historical investigation that attempts to uncover the more prosaic, yet often equally compelling, truth hidden behind the stone. It's a truth composed of dust, decay, and the faint, fragile echo of medieval anxieties preserved in crumbling ink. And every little clue you might find, outside the wall or within, adds another sentence to that silent, centuries-long story. So you linger among the presses and chained volumes, the air thick with the scent of aged parchment and contained thought. You've seen the Bibles, the commentaries, the lives of saints, the solid, comforting foundation of their spiritual and intellectual world. But then your gaze drifts to a less conspicuous shelf, perhaps tucked away in a corner, or maybe even a chest secured with a lock. And you begin to sense the presence of a different kind of text. These aren't the vibrant, illuminated manuscripts used for public liturgy or cherished for their beauty. These are perhaps plainer volumes, sometimes smaller, sometimes bound in dark, unassuming leather, the kind that doesn't call attention to itself. This is where the quiet threat resides. Monastic libraries, while primarily focused on preserving and disseminating Orthodox Christian knowledge, were also by their very nature repositories of whatever text came their way. Through donations, exchanges with other monasteries, or even the personal collections of monks who joined the community, books arrived that didn't always fit neatly into the accepted theological or philosophical framework. Think of it like your download folder today. You start with essential documents, maybe some work stuff, but over time, random PDFs, strange image files, and maybe even something you definitely shouldn't have clicked on start accumulating. The medieval monastery wasn't quite that chaotic, but information flow wasn't entirely controlled either. The dangerous books weren't necessarily bound in black with skull motifs, though that would be a delightfully spooky and entirely inaccurate image for bedtime. They looked outwardly much like other books. The danger lay within their words, within the ideas they presented. These could be texts that strayed into heresy, interpretations of scripture, or theological concepts that contradicted the official teachings of the church. Think of the various movements throughout the medieval period that were declared heretical, from the Cathars to the Waldensians, whose ideas, even if not their original texts, might be discussed, refuted, or sometimes, just sometimes, copied out of curiosity or misunderstanding. They could also be philosophical works, particularly those by ancient Greek and Roman authors that, when rediscovered and studied, presented worldviews not based on Christian revelation. Aristotle, for instance, was hugely influential, but some interpretations of his work, especially those transmitted and commented upon by Islamic scholars like Averroes, seem to contradict fundamental Christian doctrines like the immortality of the individual soul or the creation of the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. Encountering these ideas wasn't like flipping through a historical textbook. For a monk deeply steeped in faith, it was like reading a scientific paper that calmly explained why gravity doesn't exist. It shakes the foundations of everything you thought you knew. Then there were works that blurred the lines between legitimate study and forbidden practices. Texts on astrology, for instance, which wasn't entirely condemned but edged into deterministic views that challenged free will and God's providence. Works on alchemy, seeking to transmute base metals into gold or find elixirs of life. Some aspects were seen as natural philosophy, others as dabbling in forbidden arts or even demonic influence. And more straightforwardly, texts on magic, charms, or divination, which were explicitly forbidden by church law. Imagine a monk, maybe a young, intellectually curious one, assigned the task of copying a new volume that arrived. He starts transcribing the familiar Latin script, perhaps a commentary on Job. But then he moves on to another text bound in the same volume, perhaps a collection of various treatises, and he finds himself copying passages that discuss the influence of stars on human fate in a way that feels off. Or he encounters a philosophical argument that makes unsettlingly logical sense, but seems to bypass the need for divine intervention. This wasn't just academic curiosity. These were ideas that could jeopardize one's immortal soul if believed or pursued. The intellectual tension this created was immense. The monastery was meant to be a place of spiritual safety and orthodox learning. Yet here, within its very heart, were the seeds of potential error or even damnation. How were these texts handled? Sometimes they were copied precisely, so they could be refuted. Learning your enemy's arguments is a good strategy, right? But that meant reproducing the dangerous words. Sometimes they were simply kept because they were part of a larger donation or collection, perhaps unread or marked with warnings in the margins. And sometimes, despite the risks, a monk might read them out of genuine intellectual interest, struggling to reconcile the challenging ideas with his faith. A quirky tidbit about this tension: medieval scholars developed sophisticated methods of marginal annotation. In seemingly innocuous texts, you might find scribbled notes like "nota bene, error," or a simple next to a passage considered controversial. Or perhaps more tellingly, you might find passages carefully underlined, not for emphasis of truth, but perhaps for later contemplation, or even just because the copyist couldn't help but mark the point that particularly unsettled or intrigued him. These little marginalia are like whispers across the centuries, revealing the quiet internal battles fought over the words on the page. The church authorities were, of course, aware of the potential danger of unchecked texts and ideas. While the formal, systematic Index Librorum Prohibitorum, Index of Forbidden Books, came much later, precursors existed. Church councils and individual bishops would condemn specific authors or works, often related to major heresies of the time. For instance, certain writings of Peter Abelard were condemned in the 12th century for their rationalistic approach to theology, and later aspects of Averroes' philosophy were explicitly forbidden for study at places like the University of Paris. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval church engaged in significant, though often decentralized, efforts to control and regulate the flow of theological and philosophical ideas, primarily through condemnations by universities, bishops, and councils, long before the formal index was established in the 16th century. It was less like a global government blacklist and more like a network of concerned librarians and professors warning everyone about certain questionable publications. So the arrival and presence of these dangerous books weren't entirely accidental. They reflected the complex intellectual landscape of the time, where new ideas or old ideas newly rediscovered constantly interacted with established doctrine. Think about how quickly information spreads now, even controversial or untrue information. In the medieval world, books were slow, precious vectors of ideas. But once an idea was written down and copied, it had a tenacity that could span centuries. It's kind of like a really persistent earworm, but instead of a catchy tune, it's a potentially soul-damning philosophical concept. You just can't shake it. The challenge for the monks wasn't just avoiding reading these books. It was understanding them, sometimes copying them, and deciding what to do with the intellectual and spiritual questions they raised. Were these works to be studied only for refutation, or did they contain grains of truth that needed to be integrated, however carefully, into Christian thought? This is something historians still argue, whether medieval monastic scholars were primarily conservatives focused on preserving tradition, or whether they were more open to engaging with and subtly adapting new intellectual currents than previously thought. The true balance between safeguarding orthodoxy and pursuing knowledge in these libraries remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Was the library a fortress against error, or a controlled garden where potentially thorny ideas might be examined? This internal conflict, this quiet tension between the weight of tradition and the pull of challenging thought, was a constant undercurrent in the intellectual life of the monastery. Every time a monk opened a text that deviated from the norm, he wasn't just reading words. He was engaging with ideas that had the potential to disrupt his understanding of the universe, his place in it, and the very nature of his faith. It required a profound level of spiritual discipline and discernment, qualities that were central to the monastic ideal, but which were tested by the sheer variety and sometimes seductive logic of the dangerous texts. The types of texts considered risky also evolved over time. What was merely controversial in one century might become accepted in the next, or vice versa. The boundaries between philosophy and theology, astronomy and astrology, medicine and magic were often fluid, and a book's status could depend on the context, the specific interpretation offered, and the prevailing attitudes of the church authorities. It was like navigating a minefield where the mines kept changing places and sometimes looked exactly like harmless pebbles. Must have made cataloging a nightmare. This buildup of potentially problematic material wasn't a sudden invasion. It was a gradual accumulation. Over decades, perhaps even centuries, a library would gather volumes that represented not just the approved path to salvation, but also the detours, the dead ends, and the outright rebellions of human thought. Some of these books might have been explicitly condemned elsewhere, but here they were on the shelves, silent witnesses to dissenting ideas. Their very presence was a risk, a potential spark in the carefully ordered spiritual ecosystem of the monastery. It introduced an element of unpredictability, a factor that could, under the right circumstances, lead to decisions that seem extreme to us today. The quiet threat wasn't just the ideas themselves, but the possibility that they might be read, believed, and acted upon. And that possibility was about to become very real for the monks of this particular monastery. You've lingered in the library, letting the weight of centuries settle upon you, examining the quiet threat posed by certain volumes. You've felt the intellectual tension inherent in housing ideas that challenged fundamental beliefs. But now, lift your head. Listen. The thick stone walls of the monastery, usually so effective at keeping the world's cacophony at bay, aren't quite as impenetrable as they seem. Whispers find their way in, carried by travelers, pilgrims, or even other monks stopping on their journeys. And in the 14th century, those whispers were increasingly laced with anxiety and alarm. Imagine you're walking through the cloisters, the rhythmic echo of your sandals on the stone, a comforting constant. But then, a group of monks are huddled in a corner, their voices low and urgent. You catch fragments of conversation, talk of preachers in distant towns whose sermons sound strangely different, of peasants questioning the authority of the church, of lords whose loyalties seem shaky. The air feels different, charged with an unspoken fear that goes beyond the usual monastic concerns of fasting schedules and liturgical precision. France in the 14th century, like much of Europe, was not a stable place. It was a time of kings asserting power, of the papacy being based in Avignon, which itself was controversial, a French king holding the Pope effectively captive, of burgeoning national identities clashing with universal religious authority, and of social structures groaning under pressure. Peasants burdened by taxes and feudal obligations sometimes erupted in violent revolt. The Jacquerie uprising would happen a bit later, but the discontent was simmering. This wasn't just political noise. It was a world where the established order, including the church, was under strain. And crucially, it was a time when challenges to religious orthodoxy felt particularly threatening. While large, organized heresies like the Cathars had been brutally suppressed, their ideas or similar dissenting thoughts didn't entirely vanish. Groups like the Waldensians persisted in various regions, advocating for poverty and preaching in vernacular languages, often outside the control of the church hierarchy. Lollardy was emerging in England. John Hus was stirring things up in Bohemia. It was like theological whack-a-mole across the continent. These weren't just abstract debates happening in ivory towers. These were movements that could inspire widespread dissent, challenge the church's wealth and authority, and even lead to open rebellion. For monks whose lives were utterly dedicated to upholding and serving the church, such challenges were deeply unsettling. They weren't just attacks on an institution. They were attacks on the very fabric of reality solely as they understood it, on the path to salvation itself. So when news of these external stirrings reached the quiet confines of the monastery, it landed differently than idle gossip. It landed like a cold stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of unease outwards. You hear about a town where people refuse to pay tithes, citing some obscure passage of scripture interpreted in a forbidden way. You hear about a charismatic preacher who claims the Pope is the Antichrist. You hear about people meeting in secret, reading forbidden books. And suddenly, the books in your own library don't feel like passive objects of study anymore. They feel like potential conduits for the very chaos raging outside. That commentary on Aristotle you read yesterday, does it subtly undermine faith in miracles, just like those heretics claim? That treatise on astrology? Is it leading minds towards a fatalistic view that denies free will, echoing doctrines condemned by the church? That seemingly innocent collection of philosophical letters? Do they contain arguments that could be twisted to justify disobedience or rebellion? The fear was this: if these dangerous ideas were out there circulating among the populace and causing unrest, what if they were also in here within the monastery's sacred walls? What if a monk, perhaps innocently, perhaps through misplaced intellectual curiosity, were to read one of these texts and become infected by its dangerous ideas? What if he then spread those ideas among the community? Or worse, if he left the monastery and took those ideas into the world? The stakes felt incredibly high. It wasn't just about maintaining doctrinal purity. It was about safeguarding the spiritual well-being of the monks, protecting the monastery's reputation, and, from their perspective, helping to defend the very truth of the Christian faith against what felt like an onslaught of error and deception. Imagine you're living in a world where you genuinely believe incorrect ideas can damn your soul for eternity, and you hear reports of these incorrect ideas spreading like wildfire. Now look at the pile of flammable material in your own living room, or in this case, library. You'd start to feel a bit twitchy, right? A quirky tidbit about this period of fear: the lines between religious heresy, political dissent, and even perceived witchcraft could become incredibly blurred. Someone questioning church doctrine might also be accused of disloyalty to the king, and unusual practices or beliefs could be linked to demonic influence. The fear wasn't always neatly compartmentalized. It was a general dread of disorder, both spiritual and temporal. It's like when your computer gets a virus. You're not just worried about losing files, you're worried about your whole system crashing, your identity being stolen. Maybe your toaster starts ordering things online. Everything feels potentially compromised. So this external pressure, this rising tide of anxiety, began to change the internal dynamic of the monastery regarding its library. The quiet pursuit of knowledge, the diligent copying of texts suddenly took on a new layer of risk assessment. The abbot, the chapter, the governing body of the monks, and perhaps influential senior monks would have discussed the situation. News arrives, maybe via a letter from the bishop. Perhaps a visitor from another monastery recounts disturbing events. The conversation turns inward. What about our books? Do we have any of those texts? The presence of the dangerous books which before might have been tolerated as objects of potential refutation or simply ignored, now felt like an unacceptable vulnerability. Keeping them, even if locked away or marked with warnings, felt like harboring a potential enemy within the gates. What if a fire broke out? What if the monastery was attacked, and these texts fell into the wrong hands? What if a monk stumbled upon them during inventory and it was tempted? The what-ifs started piling up, each one fueling the growing sense of urgency. A mainstream historical fact is that periods of perceived religious or social crisis often led to increased censorship and control over information. While sealing a library isn't a daily occurrence, efforts to identify, condemn, and sometimes destroy texts considered heretical or dangerous were part of the church's activity throughout the Middle Ages. Universities, bishops, and religious orders issued lists of condemned propositions or authors. This wasn't a completely novel idea born out of panic. It was an intensification of existing practices in response to heightened fear. It's like security measures at airports after a major incident. The procedures were there, but they suddenly got a lot stricter and more visible. The decision to take drastic action wasn't necessarily unanimous or easy. There might have been debates. Some monks, perhaps the more scholarly ones, might have argued for the value of these texts, even for refutation, or the importance of preserving knowledge. Others, particularly those focused on spiritual purity and obedience, would have emphasized the danger and the need for decisive action. Historians still argue whether such decisions were primarily pragmatic responses to external pressure or driven more by deep-seated ideological conservatism within monastic communities. Was it genuine fear for souls or fear of consequences from higher authorities? The true motivations were likely a complex mix, but the mood was shifting. The leisurely pace of monastic life, centered around prayer and study, was being disrupted by the drumbeat of fear from the outside world. The library, once a sanctuary of learning, was starting to feel like a potential liability. The quiet presence of the dangerous books was no longer just an intellectual problem. It was a looming spiritual and even physical threat in a world that felt increasingly unstable. The decision, when it came, would have been born out of this confluence of factors: external unrest, internal fear, and the perceived risk posed by the contents of their own shelves. It wasn't a decision made lightly, but one driven by a powerful sense of perceived necessity. They weren't just tidying up, they were performing an act of spiritual defense. They were safeguarding their community, not just from invaders or famine, but from the insidious power of dangerous ideas. And in a world where ideas could genuinely be seen as spiritual poisons, the library, the very heart of their intellectual life, suddenly felt like a room full of toxic substances that needed to be contained immediately. The time for quiet contemplation was over. The time for action, perhaps extreme action, had arrived. The weight of the world's anxieties was pressing down on those quiet cloister walls, demanding a response. And that response would focus on the vulnerable heart of their institution, the books. You felt the fear build, the whispers from the outside world pressing in, the anxiety about the potential dangers lurking within the monastery walls. The books, once silent companions, have begun to hum with perceived threat. The decision wasn't impulsive, not really, but it was driven by a powerful, overriding imperative: safeguard the community, protect the faith, eliminate the perceived risk. And so the abbot and the senior monks, after agonizing debate that echoed the anxieties you overheard in the cloister, arrived at the chosen solution, the most drastic measure available. The library, or at least the section containing the most problematic volumes, would be sealed off entirely. Imagine the scene. It's not a public spectacle. Monastic life values quiet and order. But there's a palpable tension in the air. You see stonecutters arriving, their tools clanking. They're not building a new chapel or repairing a wall. They're preparing to wall up an opening. You watch as monks carefully carry armloads of books from the shelves, but not to tables for study. No, these particular volumes, the ones deemed most dangerous, the ones filled with challenging philosophy, non-canonical theology, perhaps even texts hinting at forbidden magical practices or dissenting political ideas, are being gathered together. There's a solemnity to it, almost like preparing for a burial. Each book, potentially the product of years of labor by scribes, representing lifetimes of thought, is now being classified as toxic material. The entrance to the specific alcove or room holding these books is marked. Perhaps it's a separate annex off the main scriptorium or a section of shelves cordoned off. The heavy door, if there was one, is removed or bolted permanently shut from the inside. Then the work begins. You hear the rhythmic chipping of hammers on stone, the scrape of trowels applying mortar. Dust fills the air, catching the shafts of light filtering through narrow windows. Layer by layer, rough-hewn stones are laid, mortared together, slowly obscuring the opening. The gap narrows, the light fades, the familiar scent of old parchment and ink gives way to the mineral smell of fresh lime and stone dust. It's a physical, tangible act of exclusion. They aren't just putting a lock on the door, they are erasing the door entirely, building a solid, impenetrable barrier. It's like deciding your house has a room full of invisible, infectious airborne pathogens, and the only way to be safe is to literally brick up the doorway. You lose access to whatever is in there, but you gain, they believed, security from its potential harm. It's the ultimate quarantine. The stones go higher, the wall grows thicker. The sounds from within, if there were any, maybe the scurrying of rats disturbed by the light, are muffled and then cease entirely. You stand there watching, feeling the weight of the stones, the finality of the action. This isn't just architecture, it's a theological and philosophical statement rendered in mortar and stone. They are saying definitively that some knowledge is not merely unhelpful or incorrect, but actively harmful, something that needs to be contained and suppressed for the health of the soul and the community. This act embodies the belief that ideas are powerful, capable of shaping minds and leading them astray, and that certain ideas are poisons to be isolated. It's like sealing off a hazardous waste dump, except the hazard is intellectual. The reasons, as you've come to understand, are layered. There was the deep, genuine fear of heresy spreading. In a time when the afterlife felt incredibly real, an incorrect belief could condemn one to eternal damnation. The thought of a monk being corrupted by a dangerous text was terrifying. It wasn't just about losing one's soul, it was about the potential to infect others, to weaken the spiritual foundation of the entire monastery, which was, in their eyes, a sacred endeavor. They were soldiers in a spiritual war, and these books felt like enemy propaganda. Then there was the external pressure, news of unrest, of challenges to church authority, made monasteries, as bastions of that authority, feel vulnerable. Possessing texts that could be linked to those challenges, even indirectly, could draw unwelcome attention from bishops, inquisitors, or even the king's officials. Sealing the books was a way to preemptively neutralize this risk, to demonstrate their absolute loyalty and orthodoxy. See, you can almost hear the abbot saying to a visiting dignitary, "We have purged our shelves of anything questionable. Our minds and our library are pure." It's a pragmatic move wrapped in spiritual justification. It's like suddenly getting rid of all your questionable internet search history just before your parents' visit. And there was the internal discipline. Monastic life was about order, obedience, and shared purpose. Divergent thinking, fueled by potentially dangerous texts, could sow discord, undermine the abbot's authority, and disrupt the harmonious pursuit of salvation. Sealing the books was a way to enforce intellectual conformity, to remove the temptation for monks to wander down forbidden philosophical or theological paths. It was an act of self-preservation for the community's internal cohesion. As the final stones are set and the mortar smoothed, the once open doorway is gone. There is now just a solid section of wall, perhaps indistinguishable from the rest, perhaps deliberately left rough as a quiet monument to the decision. The air begins to clear of dust, but a new kind of stillness settles. The library feels smaller, safer in one sense, but also diminished. A part of its history, a part of its potential for intellectual exploration, has been walled away, perhaps permanently. What happened to those books? That is part of the legacy and part of the historical mystery. Did they simply rot away in the darkness, succumbing to damp, insects, or time? Were they forgotten completely, the knowledge of their existence fading with the generations of monks who remembered the sealing? Or did legends persist, whispers of a hidden trove of forbidden wisdom or dangerous lore behind the wall. A quirky tidbit is that such sealed spaces in old buildings often acquire local folklore, stories of hidden treasures or spectral guardians, which speaks to the human fascination with secrets and forbidden places. It's the medieval version of that locked door in a horror movie basement. You know something is behind it, and it's probably not good. A mainstream historical fact is that the suppression and loss of texts considered heretical or dangerous contributed significantly to the fragmented nature of our understanding of medieval dissent and alternative viewpoints. While outright book burning was less common than confiscation or censoring, the intentional destruction or effective burying of texts meant that many voices and ideas from this period are only known to us through the writings of their opponents, or not at all. The sealing of a library, while perhaps an extreme method, fits into this broader pattern of controlling the flow of information and ideas in the Middle Ages, a time when the written word held immense power. The legacy of this act for the monastery itself is complex. Did it make the community more spiritually pure, more intellectually secure? Or did it stifle debate, limit the breadth of learning, and perhaps make them more vulnerable to changing ideas they couldn't now access and understand? Historians still argue whether such acts of intellectual closure ultimately protected institutions or contributed to their eventual decline by making them rigid and unable to adapt to a changing world. Did it save their souls in the short term or make them irrelevant in the long run? The books behind the wall might have been lost forever, their contents turning to dust. Or perhaps, centuries later, a renovation project, a collapse of the wall, or a deliberate search might have rediscovered them. What a moment that would be. The breaking open of a forgotten past, the airing of ideas deemed too dangerous for the 14th century. Would the texts still hold power? Would they seem quaint, terrifying, or simply sad? Remnants of fears long past. For now, though, as you stand before the newly finished wall, there is only silence where the doorway used to be. The library feels different, weighted by the absence of what was deliberately locked away. You've followed the journey of a book, from creation to potential destruction, and seen how ideas, even when inanimate, can provoke fear, trigger drastic action, and shape history in unexpected ways. The sealed library is more than just a room. It's a symbol of the eternal struggle between the desire for knowledge and the fear of its consequences, between the impulse to explore and the need to control. It's a reminder that even in the quietest places, hidden dramas play out, driven by the powerful, often invisible, force of ideas. The air in the monastery settles back into its usual rhythm, the sounds of prayer and work resuming. But you know that behind that plain stone wall, a silence deeper than the usual monastic quiet has fallen. A silence full of forgotten words, locked away thoughts, and the enduring mystery of why some ideas are simply too frightening to be left in the light. The journey through the dusty corners of history, through the fear in the ceiling, is drawing to a close. You can almost hear the silence behind the wall, a low hum of absence. Now dim the lights even further. Let the sounds around you soften. You've walked the quiet cloisters, felt the dust of the library, touched the rough stone of ancient walls, and understood the fear that led men to wall away knowledge. Let that distant echo fade now. The anxiety, the debates, the labor of sealing. Let it all drift away like smoke. Your own shelves are likely filled with books, each one a potential world, a bundle of ideas. Most, thankfully, don't come with a medieval risk assessment attached. Feel the comfort of your own space, safe and sound. The weight of history, the weight of those stones and forgotten books can lift now. There's nothing to fear here, only the quiet hum of the night. Your breathing is steady, your eyelids feel heavy. The past is settling back into silence, leaving you in the peaceful present.